During the wedding, my son's bride said, "Get out of here and don't come back. You're not welcome here." I smiled and said, "Okay, but I'll take some others with me." When she realized who had left with me, she screamed. Before I continue this story and tell you how my son's ambitious bride made the fatal mistake of underestimating the help, please let me know where you are listening from in the comments below. And hit that like and subscribe button if you believe that a person's true worth is measured by their character, not by their job title. My name is Julius Bishop. I am 72 years old, and for 50 of those years my life has been defined by the clean, sharp, and beautiful logic of a brass trumpet, music. It has been my language, my trade, and my sanctuary. I am a retired professor of music from the Ellington Conservatory, a man who finds more comfort in the complex harmonies of Thelonious Monk than in the polite, empty chatter of the world my son inhabits. My late wife, Grace, she understood that about me. She understood the difference between a high-paying job and a life's work. My son Marcus, he used to understand it. He grew up in a house filled with jazz, with art, with the quiet dignity of hard work. He grew up to be a good man, a good lawyer. But he married a woman who does not understand these things. He married Madison. Madison is an event planner. It is the perfect job for her. Her entire life is a series of perfectly staged, beautifully lit, and utterly hollow events. She is a woman who sees the world not as a place to be, but as a place to be seen. And tonight, I was a stranger in her world. It was supposedly my 72nd birthday party. Madison had insisted on throwing it for me at the grand modern house she shared with Marcus. My son had picked me up from my small, quiet apartment earlier that evening. "Madison has gone all out, Dad," he had said, his voice a mixture of pride and apology. "She really wants this to be special for you." I had just nodded. I knew my daughter-in-law. Nothing she did was ever just special. It was strategic. The house was cold, all glass and white marble, a place that felt more like a corporate art gallery than a home. Even my old, beautifully worn piano, the one thing of mine they had in the house, looked out of place in the corner like a piece of antique furniture that had been misplaced. The air was filled with the scent of expensive, exotic flowers that had no smell and the quiet, pulsing beat of electronic music I did not recognize. The house was filled with people I did not know. Tall, beautiful, and very wealthy people, their voices a low, confident murmur. They held delicate glasses of champagne, their eyes constantly scanning the room, networking, assessing, connecting. I stood in the corner near the cold, abstract painting and I held a glass of water. I was a quiet, invisible old black man in a simple, well-pressed suit, a relic from a different, less impressive world. My son Marcus, a good man, a good lawyer, looked uncomfortable, trapped in a tuxedo that was a little too tight. His eyes kept darting towards me, a quick, nervous flicker, a mixture of love and, to my deep, quiet shame, embarrassment. He would come over, ask if I was okay, and then at the slightest gesture from his wife, he would scurry back to her side. He was a man caught between two worlds, and he had, it seemed, already chosen his. And then there was Madison. She was the conductor of this orchestra, a whirlwind of blonde ambition in a tight silver dress. She moved through the crowd with a bright, tinkling, and utterly false laugh, her hand always on someone's arm, her eyes always calculating. This was not my birthday party. This was her show. I was the guest of honor, which meant I was the prop, the sentimental excuse she had used to gather all these powerful, important people in her home. She was not celebrating my life. She was leveraging it. I watched her as she orbited one man in particular. He was older, in his 60s, with a shock of white hair and a suit that cost more than my first car. He looked bored, his expression a mask of polite, neutral disinterest. This, I knew, was the real guest of honor. This was Harrison Davenport, the senior managing partner of my son's law firm, the man who held Marcus's entire future in the palm of his hand. I watched as Madison practically vibrated with the effort of trying to charm him. She laughed her bright, tinkling laugh at something he said, but his own smile didn't reach his eyes. He was a man I sensed who, like me, was more comfortable with substance than with style. And this party was all style. It was a performance that was failing. I was just a quiet ghost at my own feast, watching and waiting. I waited for the moment she would inevitably and publicly remind me of my place in her grand and very fragile design. The confirmation from Ben Peterson Jr. was a tectonic shift in the landscape of my life. It was a single, load-bearing beam placed in the center of my demolished world. For the first time in 6 months, I was not just a man surviving. I was a man with a foundation. But a foundation is not a house. I was a 1% partner. A man with a loaded gun, as Ben had so vividly put it. But a gun is a useless thing if you don't have a target. I spent the next few days in a state of quiet, suspended animation, a strange new territory between despair and hope. I was a general with a single secret soldier waiting for a war to reveal itself. I did not know what the next step was. What could I do? I could not force them to let me back into their lives. I could not with 1% overrule any decision they made. My power was a secret, but it felt like a small one, a quiet moral victory that had no real-world application. I was still an old man in a cheap room, and they were still a young, beautiful, and wealthy couple living in a luxury apartment that I had paid for. The scales still felt profoundly and unjustly unbalanced. I did not have to wait long. The call came a week after our meeting in the archive. I was at my small, rickety desk sketching a design for a dovetail joint, a simple intellectual exercise to keep my hands and my mind from growing idle. When my phone buzzed, I saw Ben's name on the screen. I answered, my heart a slow, steady drumbeat. "Cal," he said. The voice was different. The respectful, almost reverent tone from our last call was gone. In its place was something else, something I recognized from my years in the construction business. It was the low, excited hum of a hunter who has just found a fresh set of tracks in the mud. "I think I found something," he said, his voice a low, conspiratorial murmur. "Something interesting." I was silent, listening. "On a hunch," he began. "I started doing some digging into the Monarch LLC. I wasn't just going to file that agreement and forget about it. I'm a lawyer, Cal. My professional curiosity wouldn't let it go. I had to see the health of the asset my father had left you a piece of." "And?" I asked, my own voice, a quiet, steady thing. "And," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "The asset is sick, very sick." He began to explain, translating the complex world of real estate finance into the simple, direct language of a builder, a language he knew I would understand. He told me that the majority owner of the building, a large, faceless real estate investment trust out of New York, had been treating the Monarch not as a long-term investment, but as a short-term cash machine. "They're slumming it, Cal," he said, and the disgust in his voice was genuine. "They're slumlords in $1,000 suits. They've deferred all non-essential maintenance for the last 5 years. The roof is a mess, the plumbing is a patchwork of shoddy repairs, and the tenant turnover is sky-high. I looked at the online reviews for the building, and they are a nightmare. Leaks, broken elevators, no heat in the winter. They are letting a beautiful, solid brick and steel building, a building your hands helped to build, rot from the inside out." I felt a familiar and deeply unpleasant anger. It was the anger of a craftsman watching his work be disrespected, neglected. It was a professional insult. "Why?" I asked. "That's not just bad management. It's stupid. It doesn't make financial sense." "It does," Ben replied, his voice sharp, "if you're trying to make the balance sheet look good for a quick sale." The pieces of the puzzle began to click into place, a beautiful, terrible, and logical construction. "They're milking it for every last drop of cash before they dump it," he continued. "They're letting the building fall apart so they can justify a low sale price. They'll take a loss on the books, use it as a massive tax write-off, and dump the problem on some unsuspecting sucker before the whole thing literally collapses." He paused, letting the full weight of the opportunity settle. The target had just appeared on the horizon. A beautiful, wounded building, a building that was a part of my own history, was being sold at a discount by a group of neglectful fools. It was a perfect, beautiful, and deeply ironic opportunity. The gun his father had left me was now aimed at a target I had helped to build. "And here's the beautiful part, Cal," Ben said, his voice now a low, dangerous whisper. "My sources tell me they're looking to sell, right now, quietly, off-market. They don't want to list it publicly because they don't want other developers kicking the tires and seeing just how badly they've run the place into the ground. They're looking for a quick, quiet exit. They're looking for a fool." And in that moment, the final piece of the puzzle, the piece that turned this from a good business opportunity into a work of divine poetic justice, slammed into place in my mind. The Monarch. The building my daughter lived in. The building they had just kicked me out of. It was the same building. The building I had saved. The one my hands had helped to raise from a concrete skeleton. The one that had been the cause of the very debt of honor that had led to my 1% share. It was a perfect, terrible, and absolutely beautiful circle. They thought they had evicted a useless old man. But they were squatters. Squatters in a building that was in a small but profound way mine. "Ben," I said, and my voice was a quiet, steady thing, the voice of a man who has just seen the full, magnificent, and terrifying blueprint of his own destiny. "I need you to answer a simple question for me." "Anything, Cal," he said. "How much?" I asked, my voice as calm and as clear as a builder's level. "Does it cost to buy a building?" The hunt had just begun. The moment came as I knew it would just after 9 o'clock. The party was at its peak, the polite murmuring at a steady, confident hum. Madison, ever the perfect hostess, moved to the center of the room and clinked a champagne flute with a small silver spoon. The sound was sharp, and the room dutifully fell silent. All eyes turned to her. She was in her element. The spotlight was on her. "If I could have everyone's attention for just a moment," she said, her voice a bright theatrical and perfectly projected sound. She beamed at the crowd, her smile a carefully calibrated instrument of charm. "Thank you all so much for coming tonight to celebrate a very, very special man." She turned and gestured to me in my dark corner. The spotlight and all the eyes of that wealthy, unfamiliar crowd swung to me. I felt like a museum piece suddenly illuminated. "My wonderful father-in-law, Julius. It's his 72nd birthday." A polite, scattered applause filled the room. I gave a small, awkward nod, my face a mask of polite gratitude that I did not feel. "When I married Marcus," she continued, her voice now a low, intimate, and utterly false murmur, "I didn't just get a wonderful husband. I got a wonderful new father, a man of such simple, quiet dignity." Simple. The word was a small, sharp, and perfectly aimed dart. She was framing me for this audience of powerful, complex people as a simpleton. A lovable, harmless, and deeply uncomplicated relic. "We are so lucky to have him living with us," she went on, and I could see her eyes flicker for just a half-second toward Harrison Davenport, who was watching her with a polite, neutral, and deeply unreadable expression. She was not just giving a speech. She was performing her own generosity for her husband's boss. And since he's always looking for a way to make himself useful, we wanted to get him something practical, something to honor that spirit. She motioned, and a young woman from the catering staff, a woman in a real professional uniform, brought her a beautiful, silver-wrapped gift box. It was large, flat, and tied with an elegant black silk ribbon. "For you, Julius," she said, gliding over to me, holding the box out as if it were a precious offering. "Happy birthday." The room was silent. A heavy, expectant quiet. I took the box. It was light. Far too light. I could feel the eyes of everyone on me. My son Marcus was standing near the fireplace, his face a mask of pained, forced pleasantry. He was holding his champagne glass in a white-knuckled grip. He knew his wife. He knew her capacity for casual, targeted cruelty. He was bracing for the impact. I untied the ribbon. I lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in a bed of black tissue paper, was a single folded object. It was a black waist-length apron made of a heavy professional-grade cotton. A servant's apron. And embroidered on the chest in a simple, elegant, and perfectly stitched white script were 2 words. "The Help." A profound and truly icy silence filled my body. The air in my lungs seemed to turn to glass. I stared at the words, at the perfect, beautiful stitching, at the sheer calculated and breathtaking cruelty of it. This was not an accident. This was not a joke gone wrong. This was a message. This was a public and very deliberate execution of my dignity. This was a reminder of my place in her house. I was the old black charity case. And then Madison laughed. A bright tinkling and utterly soulless sound designed to break the tension she had so masterfully created. "He's always trying to help in the kitchen," she announced to the room, her voice full of a performed, good-natured exasperation. "My father-in-law just can't sit still, so we thought we'd make it official." The room, sensing its cue, produced a short, sharp, and deeply uncomfortable laugh. It was the sound of wealthy people who are embarrassed by a breach of social decorum but are too polite to say so. They were not laughing with her. They were laughing at me. And in that moment, I did not look at her. I did not look at the crowd. I looked at the one person in the room whose opinion was the only one that had ever mattered to me. I looked at my son, Marcus. His face was a dark, painful, almost purplish red. He was staring at the floor at his own expensive polished shoes as if they held the answers to the universe. He did not look at me. He did not look at his wife. He said nothing. He did nothing. He just let the silence and his wife's cruelty and the room's terrible, awkward laughter stand. And in that silence I learned everything I needed to know. The son I had raised, the boy I had taught to be a good and honorable man, was gone. He had been replaced by her husband. Madison, sensing the moment was beginning to curdle, stepped in her voice, all brightness. "He can help serve the rest of the drinks. You don't mind, do you, Julius? It's just for fun." I looked up from the apron from my son's shoes, and I looked at her. And I smiled. It was a slow, quiet, and deeply tired smile. A smile that had 50 years of music, of struggle, of pain, and of pride behind it. A smile she could not in a million years ever hope to understand. I took the apron from the box. I unfolded it. I noted the quality of the stitching. It was well made, and with the slow, deliberate movements of a man who has all the time in the world, I tied the strings neatly behind my back. "Of course not, my dear," I said, my voice as calm and as gentle as a solo from a muted trumpet. "I'm happy to help." I turned to the catering staff who were standing by the bar, their faces a mask of professional neutrality, but their eyes were full of a profound and deeply human pity. "Where do I start?" I asked. The trap was set, but they had mistaken who was the trapper and who was the prey. I did not stand there in shock. I did not protest. The father in me, the man who had been so deeply wounded by my son's silent betrayal, retreated. He was a casualty of this war. In his place, a different part of me took over. The performer, the old musician. The man who has played in 1,000 smoky hostile clubs, who knows how to read a room, how to hold a note, how to command a stage, even when that stage is not his own. I was no longer the guest of honor. I was, as the apron so clearly stated, the help. Very well. If I was to be a servant, I would be the most observant servant in the room. "Where do I start?" I had asked the young, horrified catering captain. She just stared at me, her mouth open. So I made the decision for her. I walked to the bar, picked up a polished silver tray, and I began to move through the room. My movements were slow, deliberate, invisible. The moment I had tied that apron around my waist, I had become a ghost. The wealthy, powerful guests no longer saw me. I was a 72-year-old black man in a servant's apron. I was part of the furniture. Their eyes slid right past me. They continued their loud, important conversations about stock prices and summer homes in the Hamptons as if I did not exist. It was the most profound and most useful form of invisibility in the world. And in my new role with my new superpower of invisibility, I began to observe. I was no longer a participant in this party. I was an anthropologist studying the strange tribal rituals of the rich and the heartless. And as I moved through the room collecting empty champagne flutes, my gaze kept returning to the one man my daughter-in-law Madison was orbiting like a desperate, glittering planet. This was her true guest of honor. This was Harrison Davenport. He was an older man in his late 60s with a shock of thick white hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from old expensive granite. He wore a tuxedo that was a masterpiece of quiet, understated tailoring, and he held his glass of I-noted mineral water with an air of profound and deeply bored patience. He was the target, the senior managing partner of my son's law firm, the man who held Marcus's promotion, and therefore Madison's entire fragile and over-leveraged lifestyle in the palm of his hand. And she was failing to impress him. I watched her as I collected glasses. She was a whirlwind of false bright energy, her laugh a little too loud, her smile a little too wide. She was trying to charm him, to dazzle him with the sheer expensive perfection of her party, her home, her life. "Mr. Davenport," she was saying, her voice a tinkling, desperate sound. "More champagne. Can I get you anything?" "I'm fine, thank you, Madison," he would reply, his voice a deep, polite, and utterly bored baritone. He was not interested in her performance. He was a man I sensed who had seen 1,000 of these parties, a man who was immune to the shallow, desperate charm of a social climber. His eyes were not on her. They were scanning the room, a look of quiet, intellectual detachment on his face. He was a man trapped in a room he did not want to be in, surrounded by people he did not respect. I, the invisible man. The servant continued my work. I cleared a plate of half-eaten, expensive-looking canapes. I emptied an ashtray on the terrace. And all the while, I watched him. He was the center of Madison's universe, the man she was willing to humiliate her own father-in-law to impress. He was the enemy. But as I watched him, as I saw the way his eyes glazed over when Madison laughed too loudly, as I saw him look at his own very expensive Patek Philippe, watch, a quiet, new, and very interesting thought began to form in my mind. He was not the enemy. He was a prisoner just like me. He was another soul trapped in the cold, white, and artless gallery of my daughter-in-law's ambition. He was in a way I could not yet articulate a potential ally. And he was, I noted, just like me, the only other person in the room who was not drinking. The humiliation was a physical thing. It was a sudden, icy plunge, a submersion into a cold, dark reality. The two words, "the help," embroidered on the black apron, were not a joke. They were a judgment, a verdict, a clear, concise, and brutally efficient redefinition of my place in their world. I was not a father. I was a burden, and now I was staff. The polite, uncomfortable laughter of the room was a wave of static, a distant sound that seemed to reach me from across a great echoing chasm. I could feel their eyes on me, a mixture of pity, embarrassment, and a kind of relieved cruelty. I had just become the evening's entertainment. And my son, Marcus, he had not moved. He stood by the fireplace, a statue of inaction, his face a pained crimson mask. He was a good man, I knew this. He was my son. But in that moment, his goodness was a hollow, useless thing. It had been completely overpowered by his wife's ambition and his own profound and deeply familiar fear of confrontation. His silence was his consent. His averted gaze was his signature on the order of my demotion. He had chosen her and the bright, brittle, and hollow world she was so desperate to build, a world in which I, with my old-fashioned ideas of dignity and my unglamorous past, had no place. "Of course not, my dear," I had said, my voice a calm, gentle thing I did not recognize. "I'm happy to help." I tied the strings of the apron neatly behind my back, a simple final act of capitulation. But it was not a surrender. It was a recalibration. I was no longer a guest. I was an operative. I was a spy. I turned to the real professional catering staff, the young men and women who were being paid to be there. I saw the look in their eyes, a profound and deeply human pity. They knew in an instant what this was. They were working-class people. They understood the language of humiliation. "Where do I start?" I asked, my voice a quiet murmur. The young catering captain, his face a mask of professional neutrality, just nodded towards a tray of empty champagne glasses. "If you could just clear the empties, sir." He said, his voice respectful, and his use of the word sir was a small, kind, and deeply appreciated act of rebellion against my new title. So I picked up the silver tray. It felt surprisingly light in my hands, and I began to work. I moved through the room, a ghost in a servant's apron. The moment I had tied it on, I had become invisible. The wealthy, powerful guests who had just been laughing at me now looked through me. I was no longer a person. I was a function, a pair of old black hands collecting their discarded glasses. And as I moved silent and invisible, I listened, and I watched, and I learned. I saw the intricate, invisible lines of power in the room, who was talking to whom, who was avoiding whom, and who above all was the true target of my daughter-in-law's ambition. It was Harrison Davenport. He was the sun, and she was a desperate, glittering planet orbiting him, radiating a light that was not her own. She was laughing too loudly at his jokes. She was touching his arm, a gesture of practiced, false intimacy. And he, I noted, was enduring it all with the polite and deeply bored patience of a king. I was on my second pass of the room, my tray now heavy with empty glasses, when I passed a small group of women Madison was talking to. She did not lower her voice. She did not care if the help overheard. "It's just so difficult, you know," she was saying, her voice a low, conspiratorial murmur, a performance of martyrdom. "Marcus is a saint. He insists we keep his father here. But it's a burden. He's just there, all the time." The women murmured their sympathy. "He's our little charity case," Madison continued, and she laughed, that bright, tinkling, and utterly soulless sound. "We're doing our part, you know, taking him in. It's the least we can do for the poor old thing." The poor old thing. The charity case. The words were a quiet, final twist of the knife. I did not react. I did not spill a single drop from the glasses on my tray. I simply continued my slow, steady orbit of the room. My humiliation was now complete. It was not just a private family matter. It was a public narrative, a story she was actively telling to the very people she was trying to impress. A story of her boundless generosity and my pathetic dependence. I moved through the cold marble gallery of her home, a ghost in an apron, and I felt not rage, but a profound and very clear sense of focus. She had made a critical and very common mistake. She had mistaken my silence for weakness. She had mistaken my age for irrelevance. She had no idea that the help she was so proud of caging was in fact the only person in the room who truly understood the price of her ambition, and who was in that very moment quietly and methodically beginning to calculate the cost. I continued my silent work, a ghost in the machine of Madison's ambition. My silver tray was heavy with the half-empty, abandoned glasses of her important guests. I moved through the room with a practiced, quiet efficiency, my feet making no sound on the expensive marble floors. My invisibility was my shield. It was also my vantage point. As I collected the debris of their celebration, I continued to watch the man who was the center of their universe, Harrison Davenport. He looked profoundly and deeply bored. He was a man trapped in a performance that was not his own, a lion in a cage of polite, meaningless chatter. He had a look in his eyes that I recognized the look of a man who would rather be anywhere else in the world. He was trapped in a conversation with a young, aggressive-looking man in a suit, someone I assumed was another lawyer from my son's firm. The young man was talking loudly, gesticulating, trying to impress. Davenport, on the other hand, was a mask of polite, granite-like patience. His eyes, however, were moving. They were scanning the room, searching not for another person to network with, but for an escape. His gaze drifted past the bar over the crowd, and finally it landed in the quiet, shadowed corner of the room. It landed on my piano. It was an old, beautiful Steinway, upright, its mahogany wood worn and scarred, a veteran of 1,000 smoky clubs and late-night practice sessions. It was the only thing in this cold, white room that had a soul. It was the only thing I had insisted on bringing with me when I moved in. Madison hated it. She said it was cluttered and old-fashioned. Slowly and with the practiced, subtle movement of a man who knows how to escape a conversation without causing a scene, Davenport disengaged. He gave the young lawyer a polite nod, a politician's empty smile, and he began to drift. He was not drifting toward the bar or toward the terrace. He was drifting toward the music. He was drifting toward the one real, honest thing in the entire room. He came to a stop in front of the piano. He stood there for a long moment, just looking at it. He ran a hand over the scarred, polished wood, a gesture of affection, of familiarity. Then, as if he couldn't help himself, he sat down on the bench. He didn't look around to see if anyone was watching. He was in his own world now. He lifted his hands to the keys, and his fingers, long and elegant, rested on them for a moment. Then he began to play. It was not a showy performance. It was a quiet, almost private act of communion. He played a single complex chord, a beautiful, dissonant, and utterly unmistakable sound, a Thelonious Monk chord. He was not a beginner. He moved from that chord into a short, difficult, and beautiful phrase, a piece of harmonic genius from Round Midnight. His left hand was solid, his right hand was inventive, but he was struggling with a specific transition, a notoriously difficult fingering. I had been on my way to the kitchen, my tray heavy with glasses, my mind 1,000,000 miles away. But the music, that sound, it stopped me in my tracks. It was a language I understood. It was the language of my soul. I stood there a few feet away in my servant's apron, and I watched him. I watched him try the phrase again, his brow furrowed in concentration. He fumbled, the fingering grimaced, and then tried it a third time. He was close, but not quite there. And then, without thinking, without considering my place, my role, in this ridiculous, cruel play, I spoke. The musician in me, the professor, the man who has spent a lifetime dedicated to the pursuit of this beautiful, difficult craft, simply could not stay silent. That's a difficult transition. I said, my voice quiet but clear in the relative hush of the corner. Monk had a strange, beautiful, and almost impossible way of voicing his chords. Harrison Davenport froze. His hands, which had been so full of life on the keys, went still. He looked up, his head turning slowly, his eyes finding me. He was not angry at the interruption. He was surprised. He was shocked. He was looking at a 72-year-old black man in an apron that said, "The Help." a man who was holding a silver tray of empty glasses, and that man had just spoken to him not as a servant, but as a peer, as a fellow musician. "You have to keep that pinky finger flat," I continued, gesturing with my free hand. "You're curling it. You have to treat that last note not as a grace note, but as the foundation of the next chord. It's a pivot, not a step." The richest, most powerful man in the room, the target of my daughter-in-law's entire desperate social campaign, just stared at me, his mouth slightly open, a look of profound and deeply intrigued disbelief on his face. The performance was over. A real and far more interesting conversation was about to begin. My words, "You have to treat that last note not as a grace note, but as the foundation of the next chord," landed in the quiet corner with the weight of a stone dropped into a still pond. Harrison Davenport, the most powerful man in the room, the man my daughter-in-law was practically salivating to impress, froze. His hands, which had been so full of a tense, frustrated life on the keys, went completely still. He turned on the piano bench, a slow, deliberate movement, and looked up at me. He was not looking at me with the polite, dismissive gaze he had reserved for Madison. He was not looking at me with the angry, impatient glare of a wealthy man whose private moment has been interrupted by a servant. He was looking at me with a look of profound and deeply intrigued disbelief. His eyes, the sharp analytical eyes of a high-powered lawyer, scanned me, taking in the cheap black, humiliating apron embroidered with the words, "The Help," and the silver tray of half-empty champagne flutes I was still holding, and he was trying and failing to reconcile that image with the words I had just spoken. He was a man who had just seen a stray dog on the street perfectly recite a line of Shakespeare. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice a low, cautious rumble, all the boredom gone, replaced by a new, sharp and focused energy. "What did you just say?" I said. I repeated, my voice quiet, calm, the voice of a professor addressing a student. "You're curling your pinky." It's a common mistake with that particular monk voicing. He wrote his music for his own large, splayed hands. The rest of us, I said, a small, sad smile touching my lips, have to find a way to adapt. You have to pivot on that B flat, not just brush against it. It's the anchor for the entire phrase. Davenport just stared at me. The polite social mask was gone. This was the real man, a man of intellect, a man of passion. And his passion, I had just discovered, was the same as mine. "You know, monk," he stated, it was not a question. It was a statement of profound, almost joyful shock. I smiled, a real smile this time, not the pained, polite mask I had been wearing all night. "I've had the pleasure," I said. I saw him play at the 5-spot back in '58. He had a way of hitting the keys as if they had personally insulted him. It was a beautiful, angry, and deeply logical sound. The name 5-spot was a password, a secret handshake. It was the name of a hallowed, long-gone New York jazz club, a place where legends had been born, a place a man like Harrison Davenport in his expensive modern world would only know from books and old, scratchy recordings. His eyes widened. You were there," he whispered, his voice full of a sudden, almost reverent awe. He was no longer a senior partner at a law firm. He was a fan, a true believer. He had just met a man who had walked in the Holy Land. "I was a young man then," I said, my gaze drifting past him back into my own long-forgotten past. "Just a kid with a trumpet trying to find my own voice." I had forgotten for a moment where I was. I had forgotten the apron. I had forgotten the tray in my hands, which was now uncomfortably heavy. I was just a musician talking to another musician. The most natural and most honest conversation in the world. "You play," he said again, a statement, not a question. "Trumpet," I confirmed. He looked at me, at my calloused fingers, at my 72-year-old face, at the apron, and the pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture that he found both impossible and at the same time undeniably true. He, a man whose entire life was about assessing the value of things, had just found a priceless artifact in the trash heap of my daughter-in-law's social climbing party. The room around us, the loud, empty chatter, the pulsing synthetic music, all of it had faded away. We were in our own world now, a world of dissonant chords, of complex rhythms, of a shared and deeply profound respect for the masters. "I'm sorry," he said, standing up from the piano bench, a new and deeply respectful energy in his movements. "I am Harrison Davenport." He held out his hand not to a servant but to an equal, a colleague. "And you are—" There stood Harrison Davenport, a man worth billions of dollars, my son's boss, and he just held out his hand. Not to a waiter, but to a colleague. "I'm Harrison Davenport," he said, "and you are—" I looked down at my hand. It was clean, but not the soft hand of someone like him. It was a musician's hand with calluses on the fingertips, and at the moment it held a silver tray filled with empty glasses. I felt ridiculous. I set the tray down on the piano, and in a gesture of a working man's instinct, I wiped my palm on my apron. The apron had the word servant embroidered on it. Only after my hands were dry did I take his. "Julius Bishop," I said. "My friends call me Jules." His handshake was firm, but it was his eyes that caught my attention. He froze. The enthusiasm of a jazz fan who had just found a soulmate was gone, replaced by an intense, almost judicial focus. "Julius Bishop," he repeated, his voice low and slow. He didn't let go of my hand. That name. Why do I know that name? He was searching his memory, a brain clearly trained to remember thousands of details. "You were at the 5 spot. You knew Monk. You played the trumpet." And then I saw it. A change. It wasn't a blink. It was a collapse of his entire being. Harrison Davenport's eyes widened, not in surprise, but in absolute shock. He let go of my hand as if he'd been touched by an electric current. He took a step back, a rare loss of control in such a powerful man. "My God," he whispered, his voice now a dry hiss. "It can't be. You can't be. You can't be. Professor Jules Bishop, from Ellington Conservatory." I didn't say anything. I simply nodded a small affirmative gesture. "No, no," he stammered. And for the first time that night I saw the real man behind the CEO's mask. He was no longer a boring, powerful boss. He was a boy who had just seen his idol. "Professor Bishop," he said, and the way he pronounced professor was so reverent, it was almost a prayer. "Your record, Midnight Blue." God, that record. It got me through my second year of law school. I listened to it 1,000 times. I saw you perform in New York at the Blue Note in 1995. He was speaking not to me but to a legend. You are a legend. A legend. A luxury when you're standing here in a cold marble room wearing an apron embroidered with the word servant. I glanced over his shoulder. Across the room I saw my daughter-in-law Madison. She was looking at us, her beautiful face twisted in a barely concealed anger. She couldn't hear what we were saying. She only saw her old, annoying servant disturbing the most important guest, monopolizing his precious time. She started walking toward us, a silver shark gliding to protect its prey. But Davenport didn't see her. He only saw me. "My son," he said, his voice cracking with uncontrollable emotion. "My son, Richard. He plays trumpet because of you. He spent his senior summer trying to learn your solo in Ellington's solitude. I'm the major donor to the Ellington Conservatory's Jazz Scholarship Fund. I've been trying to arrange a meeting with you for years, Professor. I had no idea you were Marcus's father." That was it. Lightning strike. The death blow. The man my daughter-in-law was trying so hard to impress, the man she was willing to humiliate me to please, was the biggest donor to the place I had devoted my life to. A perfect and cruel twist of fate. "I'm just a retired old man, Harrison," I said, my voice soft, "just trying to help my family." The words "helping the family" seemed to wake him up. His eyes, which had been shining with adoration, suddenly moved downward. He looked at my apron. For the first time, he actually read the words embroidered on it. The help. The help. Harrison Davenport's expression changed. The fan's smile was gone. The respect was gone. In its place was something cold, hard, and dangerous. The lawyer was back. He stared at the apron, then up at me, then back at the apron again. His silence was more terrifying than Madison's screams. "Jules," he said, his voice now a cold whisper. "What the hell is going on here?" And just then Madison arrived, her face a bright fake smile. "Mr. Davenport," she cried, her voice like a bell. "I'm sorry my father-in-law bothered you. Real human conversation from ever taking root." My conversation with Harrison Davenport, however, had been a violation of that design. It had been real. It had been a quiet, passionate, and deeply personal exchange between two men who spoke a language no one else in that room understood. We were in our own world, a small sacred island in the middle of her cold marble ocean. And she, the hostess, the queen of this domain, was not on that island, and she could not stand it. "Mr. Davenport," Her voice was a bright tinkling and utterly false sound, a glass bell rung to shatter the intimate silence that had fallen between us. She arrived in a cloud of expensive perfume, her silver dress glittering, her face a mask of perfect practiced charm. She did not look at me. In her mind, I had ceased to be a person and had become a malfunctioning appliance. She only had eyes for him. "I am so sorry," she cooed, her voice a perfect performance of a gracious hostess who has just discovered a flaw in the service. She placed her hand on Davenport's arm, a familiar possessive gesture, a claim of ownership. "I cannot believe my father-in-law has been bothering you. He just doesn't know when to stop, I'm afraid." "Bothering me?" Davenport repeated, his voice a low, quiet rumble, but I saw his eyes, the sharp, analytical eyes of a lawyer, harden. He was looking at her, but he was seeing her, really seeing her for the first time. Madison, oblivious to the shift in the room's temperature, turned her bright, brittle smile on me. It was not a smile. It was the baring of teeth. "Julius," she said, her voice dropping, the sweetness curdling into a low, sharp, and deeply annoyed hiss. "What are you doing? You're supposed to be helping. You're holding Mr. Davenport hostage." She was trying to reestablish the narrative, to put me back in my box. She was a stage manager, and her prop had just started talking. She turned back to Davenport, her brightness instantly miraculously restored. "He's just so passionate about his little hobbies," she said with a dismissive, indulgent laugh, as if I were a child who had just shown a guest his rock collection. "I'm sure he was boring you to tears with his old music stories." She was, I realized, not just insulting me. She was insulting him. She was insulting his passion, his intelligence, his entire world. She was so blinded by her own ambition, so convinced of my irrelevance that she had no idea the very ground she was standing on was beginning to crack. "Now," she continued, a note of finality in her voice, "Mr. Davenport, can I get you a fresh drink? Or perhaps some of the—" "Oh." She feigned a sudden realization, a brilliant theatrical pivot. She turned to me, her eyes cold, her smile a weapon. "Julius, the ice. The bar is running low on ice. Could you please go and see to that? Go take care of the ice." It was a direct, public, and utterly humiliating command. It was not a request. It was an order given to a servant designed to remind everyone in the room, especially Davenport, of my true, simple place in her grand design. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was electric. It was the sound of a bomb being disarmed, or perhaps being armed. I looked past Madison, past Davenport, to my son, Marcus. He was standing by the fireplace, frozen, a statue of shame. He was watching this. He saw the apron. He heard the command. And he did nothing. His inaction was a physical blow, a final confirmation of his abdication. He had chosen his side. But Harrison Davenport was not my son. He did not look at the floor. He slowly, deliberately, and with an almost surgical precision, removed Madison's hand from his arm. He did not brush it off. He lifted it as if it were a piece of soiled garbage and set it aside. He then turned his full, undivided, and now utterly cold attention to her. The temperature in our quiet corner of the room seemed to drop by 20 degrees. "Bothering me?" he asked, his voice a low, quiet, and incredibly dangerous rumble. "Bothering me? Madison." He looked at me, at the apron, then back at her. "Madam," he said, and the use of that cold, formal word was a gunshot in the polite murmuring room. "I am in the middle of the most important conversation I have had in the last 20 years. A conversation I have been trying to have for a decade. You are not just interrupting. You are committing an act of profound and almost unbelievable sacrilege." Harrison Davenport's words, "an act of profound and almost unbelievable sacrilege," landed in the room with the force of a physical blow. The quiet, synthetic pulse of the electronic music seemed to stop. The murmuring of the crowd seemed to die. All the air, all the sound, all the false, glittering energy of the party was sucked into the vacuum of that one terrible and beautifully precise accusation. Madison froze. The perfect, charming smile on her face did not fade. It shattered like a porcelain mask dropped on a marble floor. She stared at Davenport, her face a mask of pure, uncomprehending horror. She was an event planner, a woman whose entire life was built on the flawless execution of social graces, and the most important man in her world had just, in a quiet, clear, and utterly devastating voice, accused her of committing a mortal sin. What? She stammered, her voice a small strangled thing she did not recognize. She was a master of words, of spin, of managing perceptions. But she had no script for this. She had no way to process the data. She was a performer whose audience had just in the middle of her greatest performance stood up and declared that the play was a fraud. Davenport did not look at her, not at first. His eyes, the cold, analytical eyes of a lawyer who has just seen the one critical piece of evidence that wins the case, moved from her face. Down to the silver tray of empty glasses I was still ridiculously holding. And then his gaze moved to the object that was the centerpiece of this entire grotesque theater, the apron, the black cotton servant's apron, and he read the words embroidered on it, his lips moving silently, a prosecutor reading the final damning line of a forced confession. The help. The silence in the room was now a living thing. It was a monster. It was the sound of a universe reordering itself. He looked up from the apron, and his eyes, now as cold and as hard as a piece of polished granite, met hers. The blood drained from Madison's face. She looked in that moment like a woman who had just seen a ghost, and in a way she had. The ghost of her own social and professional future dying right in front of her. "You," Davenport said, and his voice was not a roar. It was a whisper, a low-controlled and utterly lethal whisper that was more terrifying than any shout could ever have been. "You, the wife of Marcus Bishop, the daughter-in-law of this man." He gestured to me not as a prop, but as a monument. "You have him, wearing that." He was not just asking a question, he was delivering a verdict. And then he did something that sealed her fate. He looked at my son. He looked at Marcus, who was still standing by the fireplace, a statue of his own profound and deeply pathetic inaction. "And you, Marcus," Davenport said, his voice now laced with a new and even more terrible emotion, disappointment. "You stood here. You watched this. You allowed this. My son, the brilliant lawyer, the man who could argue a corporate merger into submission, simply crumpled. He did not speak. He just looked at his boss, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated, and career-ending shame. He had been weighed. He had been measured. And in the one moment that had truly mattered, he had been found wanting. "This is not a party." Davenport said, his voice a low growl of pure righteous fury. He was no longer a guest. He was a judge. "This is a Roman circus, a public humiliation." He turned his full, undivided, and now completely incinerating attention back to my daughter-in-law. You put a man like Julius Bishop," he said the name as if it were a sacred thing, "a man whose music has given me more joy, more solace than anything in my entire empty and overpaid life. You put him in an apron, and you asked him to serve drinks." He said the words "serve drinks" as if they were the foulest, most obscene profanity he had ever uttered. Madison, the queen of her own perfect white marble world, was now a defendant in a trial she could not win. She had been so focused on impressing the king that she had, in her profound and deeply ignorant arrogance, spat upon his God. The silence in the room was a living thing. It was a cold, heavy, and deeply uncomfortable entity, and it was suffocating my daughter-in-law. Madison stood there, her face a mask of pale, waxy, and utterly frozen horror. The confident, glittering hostess, who had just moments before been the center of this universe, was gone. In her place was this diminished thing, a statue of her own catastrophic and very public failure. She had not just insulted her father-in-law. She had, in her profound and deeply ignorant arrogance, committed a mortal sin against the very man she was trying to impress. She had spat on his God. And his God, it turned out, was me. Harrison Davenport, a man who I now realized was a creature of immense and quiet passion, did not look at her again. He had delivered his verdict, and in his world, the world of absolute power and unshakable conviction, she had simply ceased to exist. He dismissed her as one would dismiss a fly, and he turned his full and now warmly respectful attention back to me. "Professor Bishop," he said, and his voice was no longer the cold, sharp instrument of a lawyer, but the warm, rich, and deeply reverent tone of a true fan. "I cannot in good conscience remain in a place where a man of your stature is treated with such profound disrespect." He looked down at the ridiculous, humiliating apron I was still wearing, the black cotton, a stark, ugly symbol of my daughter-in-law's cruelty. The words, "the help," seemed to pulse in the quiet, heavy air. Then he did something I will never forget. "Harrison Davenport, the senior managing partner of one of the most powerful law firms in Atlanta. A man whose suit was worth more than my car slowly, and with a deep, almost ceremonial deliberation, began to shrug off his own tuxedo jacket. It was a beautiful, bespoke garment of black Italian wool lined with a rich, dark silk. It was the armor of his class, of his power, and he, in a gesture of the most profound and public act of chivalry I have ever witnessed, stepped forward, and he gently, respectfully draped that expensive, beautiful, and wonderfully warm jacket over my shoulders. He covered the apron, he covered the words, he covered my shame. He did not do it as an act of charity, he did it as an act of respect, as a student would cover the shoulders of a revered and badly treated master. "That's better," he said, his voice a low, satisfied growl. He looked at me, his eyes the eyes of a man who was now in this moment not just my ally, but my student, my friend. "Professor Julius Bishop," he said, and his voice was now a warm and very public invitation. "I cannot imagine a greater honor than to share a drink with you. Would you, sir, do me the honor of allowing me to buy you a brandy? At a place where the music is real and the conversation is at the very least intelligent." "It is clear to me," he said, his voice rising just enough for the entire silent and horrified room to hear, "that your genius and your dignity are not appreciated in this establishment." I looked at him, at this powerful man who had in a single beautiful and deeply human gesture given me back my own name. I looked past him at my son Marcus, who was still frozen by the fireplace, his face a mask of a shame so profound it was almost a form of paralysis. He had been given a choice, a chance to defend his father, and he had failed. And now this stranger, this man his wife was so desperate to impress, had done the job for him. The irony was a bitter metallic taste in my mouth. I had lost a son, but I had, it seemed, gained an ally. I reached up and adjusted the collar of the heavy silk-lined jacket on my shoulders. It was a perfect fit. I looked at Harrison Davenport and I smiled, a real, genuine, and deeply tired smile. "I would be delighted, Harrison," I said. "I would be absolutely delighted." And together, the titan of industry and the man in the borrowed tuxedo jacket, we turned to walk away, leaving my daughter-in-law to drown in the ruins of her own perfectly staged and now utterly demolished party. I looked at Harrison Davenport, at this powerful man who had just with a single magnificent gesture restored my dignity. The heavy silk-lined tuxedo jacket on my shoulders was a profound comfort, a suit of armor gifted to me by an unexpected ally. "I would be delighted, Harrison," I said. "I would be absolutely delighted." I turned away from the piano, my back now straight, my head held high. I was no longer the invisible servant. I was Professor Julius Bishop, and I was for all intents and purposes the guest of honor once more. Davenport, a man of decisive action, did not wait. He began to walk towards the foyer, a clear, powerful signal that the evening, in his estimation, was over. I moved to walk with him, a quiet older man, now flanked by the most powerful man in the room. The entire party, which had been a sea of murmuring conversations, was now a dead, silent ocean. Every eye was on us. They were watching a power shift, a profound and tectonic realignment of the social order, and they were holding their breath. We had almost reached the grand marble foyer when a new frantic energy cut across our path. It was Madison. She was no longer the calm, collected, and infinitely charming hostess. She was a woman in a state of pure, unadulterated panic. Her face was a mask of waxy pale horror, her eyes wide with the terror of a socialite who has just witnessed her own public execution. "Mr. Davenport," she cried, her voice a high-pitched, desperate, and utterly false sound. You're not leaving, are you? The party is just getting started?" Davenport did not even slow down. He was a shark and she was a minnow in his path. He simply looked straight ahead as if she did not exist. "Good night, Madison," he said, his voice a cold, final, and utterly dismissive thing. "Thank you for the education." But Madison was desperate. This was not just a guest leaving her party. This was her husband's career walking out the door. She lunged not at Davenport, but at me. She grabbed my arm, her perfectly manicaled nails digging into the sleeve of the jacket I wore. "Dad," she hissed, her voice a low, venomous, and terrified whisper. "Where do you think you're going? You can't just leave. This is your party. You can't do this to Marcus. You can't—" I stopped. I turned to look at her. I looked at her, my daughter-in-law, this woman who had just 30 minutes ago publicly and cruelly humiliated me, who had handed me an apron and told me to get to work. And now she was begging me to stay, not out of love, not out of remorse, but because her husband's boss, her golden goose, had decided I was the more interesting dinner companion. The irony was so perfect, so beautiful, it was almost musical. I smiled at her. It was the same quiet and deeply tired smile I had given her when she had handed me the apron. "I'm leaving Madison," I said, my voice a calm, gentle, and unarguable statement of fact. "Your hostess, as you so clearly pointed out, just asked me to go." "What?" she stammered, her eyes wide with confusion. I didn't." "You told me to go get ice, my dear," I said, my voice still a gentle, explanatory murmur. "You insisted I make myself useful. I am simply following your instructions." "I am getting out of the way, as you wished." Her face crumpled as she understood the quiet, devastating precision of my words. She understood that I was not leaving. I was being obedient. But you can't," she pleaded, her eyes darting to Davenport, who was watching this exchange with the quiet, detached interest of a judge. I gently, very gently removed her hand from my arm. "Oh, but I am," I said, my voice a final, soft, and utterly damning whisper. "But don't you worry. I won't be leaving alone." I smiled at her, a real smile this time, a smile of a musician who is about to hit the perfect final and devastatingly beautiful high note. "I'll be taking some others with me." And with that, I turned my back on her and walked away, leaving her to stare in pure, uncomprehending horror as the real and final act of the evening began. My words, "I'll be taking some others with me," were a quiet, simple statement of fact, but in that silent, superheated room, they were a declaration of war. Madison stared at me, her mind a frantic, desperate calculator trying to process this new impossible variable. What was I talking about? How could this old man, this servant, take anyone? Who would he take? The catering staff. She was so lost in her own narrow and deeply flawed definition of power that she could not see the new invisible lines of influence that had just been drawn in her own living room. She was about to find out. Harrison Davenport, who had been watching this final quiet exchange with the detached professional interest of a senior partner observing a cross-examination, now stepped forward. He was done being a spectator. It was time for him to reassert his authority and end this charade. He looked past Madison, his eyes scanning the room, which was now a collection of small, silent, and deeply uncomfortable clusters of guests. "Gentlemen," he called out, his voice, not a shout, but a clean, sharp, and authoritative command that cut through the silence. "Thompson, Riley, McDougal, are we ready?" The room, which was already silent, became a tomb. I saw three young men. Three men I had seen Madison and Marcus fawning over earlier in the evening. Three men in identical, expensive-looking suits immediately snapped to attention. They were the young guns from Marcus's firm, the future partners, the very men whose respect Madison had been trying to win by performing this elaborate and now disastrous social ritual. They had been trapped in a polite, awkward conversation near the bar, but at the sound of Davenport's voice, they turned as one. They saw their boss, the man who held their entire professional futures in his hands, standing at the door. He was not with his hosts. He was standing beside the old black man in the servant's apron, an old man who was now wearing Harrison Davenport's own tuxedo jacket. The three young lawyers were not fools. They were predators, just like their boss. And they had the keen animal instinct to know in an instant where the power in a room had just shifted. They saw Madison, her face a mask of pale, waxy, and desperate horror. They saw my son Marcus, a silent, crimson-faced statue of shame by the fireplace. And they saw their king, Harrison Davenport, standing by the exit, his hand resting respectfully on my shoulder, as if he were my bodyguard. They did not hesitate. "Yes, sir, Mr. Davenport," one of them, Thompson, called out, his voice a bright, clear, and utterly decisive sound. He immediately placed his unfinished drink on the bar and began to move toward the door. The other two followed a loyal corporate phalanx, their movement sharp and purposeful. They were abandoning a failing asset. They were cutting their losses. The social and professional annihilation of my daughter-in-law was now complete. She had staked her entire evening on impressing the king, and in her catastrophic, arrogant miscalculation, she had not only insulted his god, but she had now in front of everyone lost the loyalty of his entire court. The three young lawyers, her secondary targets. The future of the firm were now quite literally walking out on her, following the man in the apron. They reached the foyer, their faces a perfect neutral mask of professional loyalty. "Professor Bishop," Thompson said, giving me a respectful, almost deferential nod. "It is a genuine honor, sir." Davenport clapped me on the shoulder again, the gesture a warm and very public embrace. "Good," he said, his voice a low, satisfied growl. "Let's go." "I believe," he said, his voice rising just enough for the entire silent and horrified room to hear, "that Professor Bishop is going to tell us all about the night he saw Miles Davis debut So What at the Vanguard." He looked at Madison one last time, his eyes as cold and as empty as the marble floor. "A story," he said, "with some real substance." And with that, the five of us, the titan of industry, the three rising stars of the Atlanta legal world, and the old, useless music teacher in his borrowed jacket, turned and walked out the front door. We left it open, a final parting insult. And as we walked into the cool night air, we left behind a party that was now awake, a hostess who was now a ghost, and my son, a man who had just silently, and for no good reason at all, watched his entire future walk out the door. I didn't need to be in the room to see what happened next. I knew. As I sat in the back of Harrison Davenport's town car, a vehicle so quiet it felt like a bank vault flanked by three of the firm's brightest young lawyers, all of them now treating me with a hushed, almost reverent awe. My mind was back in that cold, white room. I could picture the scene as if it were a piece of music I had composed myself. The five of us had walked out, and the heavy custom-made front door would have closed behind us, not with a slam, but with a quiet, expensive, and deeply final thud. That sound I knew would be the gunshot that officially started the panic. For a moment, there would be a profound and truly terrible silence. The generic pulsing electronic music that Madison had so carefully chosen would suddenly seem incredibly loud, foolish, and obscene in the quiet, horrified room. The remaining guests, the B-list, the people who were not important enough to be included in Harrison Davenport's inner circle, would be frozen, their champagne glasses halfway to their mouths, their faces a mask of polite social terror. They had not just come to a party, they had come to witness a public execution, a professional and social execution. And the person in the guillotine was not the old man in the apron, but the hostess who had, with a single catastrophic miscalculation, just destroyed her husband's career. All eyes would have turned to her. Madison. She would still be standing in the foyer, her hand outstretched, her mouth slightly open, a perfect glittering statue of her own ruin. Her smile, the bright, false event planner smile, would still be frozen on her face, but it would be a grotesque thing, now a rictus of horror. She was a conductor whose entire orchestra had just stood up, broken their instruments, and walked off the stage following the janitor. And then I see her turning her movements slow, robotic, to look at the one person left in the room who mattered, Marcus, my son. He would no longer be staring at the floor. He would be looking at her, and the look in his eyes, the look of pained, embarrassed love, would be gone. In its place, I knew would be something new, something cold, something I had not seen in him since he was a young, brilliant, and deeply principled law student before he had met her. He would be seeing his wife not as the beautiful, charming, and ambitious woman he adored, but as the reckless, cruel, and profoundly foolish woman who had, just for the sake of a cheap theatrical power play, humiliated his father and incinerated his own future. He would be seeing her for the first time not as his wife, but as a liability. And then the social contagion would begin. A woman near the bar, someone I did not know, would have let out a small, nervous laugh.
"My goodness,"
she would say, her voice a high-pitched, unnatural thing. "Is that the time? We have such an early start tomorrow, Roger. We really must be going." It was a signal, the polite collective lie, the stampede for the door. One after another, the remaining guests would have surged forward, a wave of polite, panicked excuses. "Madison, darling, it was just lovely, but we have to run. Marcus, we'll call you. What an eventful evening. Thank you so much for having us." They were not just leaving a bad party. They were fleeing a contaminated site. They were rats abandoning a ship that had just been torpedoed by its own captain. In less than 5 minutes, the room, which had been a buzzing hive of manufactured importance, would be empty. Utterly, completely, and devastatingly empty. All that would be left would be the real help, the catering staff, who were now quietly and with a terrible professional efficiency clearing the debris. Their silent, neutral faces, their refusal to make eye contact with Madison, would be the final, most profound judgment of all. And so I picture my son and my daughter-in-law standing alone in the center of their vast white marble room. surrounded by the wreckage of their ambition. 100 half-empty glasses of champagne, plates of untouched expensive food now growing cold. The silver-wrapped gift box with the apron still inside sitting on the table like a bomb. The electronic music still pulsing a sad, lonely, and ridiculous heartbeat for a party that was now a funeral. The silence between them would be a vast, cold, and deeply uncomfortable thing, a new and permanent foundation for their marriage. The party, her great triumphant performance, was over. The social execution was complete. The heavy, custom-made front door closed with a soft, expensive, and devastatingly final thud. That sound was the only sound. The quiet, synthetic pulse of the electronic music that Madison had so carefully chosen had been turned off by one of the caterers, who now seemed to be the only people in the room who knew what to do. They moved with a quiet, professional efficiency, clearing away the debris of a party that had just died a very public and very sudden death. The air in the room, which had been a buzzing hive of manufactured importance, was now a dead, heavy, and deeply uncomfortable vacuum. The remaining guests, the B-list, the people who were not important enough to be included in Harrison Davenport's inner circle, were frozen. They stood in small, awkward clusters, their champagne glasses held halfway to their mouths, their faces a mask of polite social terror. They had not just come to a party, they had come to witness a public execution, a professional and social execution. And the person in the guillotine was not the old man in the apron, but the hostess who had, with a single catastrophic miscalculation, just destroyed her husband's career. All eyes would have turned to her. Madison. She was still standing in the foyer, her hand outstretched, her mouth slightly open, a perfect glittering statue of her own ruin. Her smile, the bright, false event planner smile, was still frozen on her face, but it was a grotesque thing now, a rictus of horror. She was a conductor whose entire orchestra had just stood up, broken their instruments, and walked off the stage following the janitor. And then, I see her turning her movements slow, robotic, to look at the one person left in the room who mattered. Marcus. My son. He was no longer staring at the floor. He had looked up, his face a mask of a shame so profound it was almost a form of paralysis. He was watching his wife, and the look in his eyes, the look of pained, embarrassed love, was gone. In its place was something new, something cold, something I had not seen in him since he was a young, brilliant, and deeply principled law student before he had met her. He was seeing his wife for the first time, not as the beautiful, charming, and ambitious woman he adored, but as the reckless, cruel, and profoundly foolish woman who had, just for the sake of a cheap theatrical power play, humiliated his father and incinerated his own future. He was seeing her for the first time not as his wife, but as a liability. And then the social contagion, the panic began. A woman near the bar, someone I did not know, a woman with too many diamonds and a small nervous dog in her purse, let out a high-pitched, unnatural laugh. "My goodness," she said, her voice a reedy, trembling thing. "Is that the time we have such an early start tomorrow, Roger? We really must be going." It was a signal, the polite collective lie, the stampede for the door. One after another, the remaining guests surged forward, a wave of polite, panicked excuses. "Madison, darling, it was just lovely," a man with a red face said, not quite meeting her eye. "But we have to run. Babysitter." "Marcus," another said, clapping him on the shoulder in a gesture that was meant to be supportive but looked like a blow. "We'll call you. What an eventful evening." They were not just leaving a bad party. They were fleeing a contaminated site. They were rats abandoning a ship that had just been torpedoed by its own captain. In less than 5 minutes, the room, which had been a buzzing hive of manufactured importance, was empty. Utterly, completely, and devastatingly empty. All that was left was the real help, the catering staff, who were now quietly and with a terrible professional efficiency clearing the debris. Their silent, neutral faces, their refusal to make eye contact with Madison was the final, most profound judgment of all. And so I picture my son and my daughter-in-law standing alone in the center of their vast white marble room, surrounded by the wreckage of their ambition. 100 half-empty glasses of champagne, plates of untouched expensive food now growing cold. The silver-wrapped gift box with the apron still inside sitting on the table like a bomb, its black silk ribbon like a funeral wreath. The electronic music, which no one had bothered to turn back on, had been replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. The party, her great triumphant performance, was over. The social execution was complete. The silence between them was a vast, cold, and deeply uncomfortable thing, a new and permanent foundation for their marriage. For a long time there was only silence. The sound of the catering staff quietly packing their silver trays in the kitchen. The distant, indifferent hum of the city. Madison and Marcus stood in the center of their cold, white marble room, two statues in a gallery of their own failure. Madison was trembling, not with cold, but with a rage, so profound, so volcanic, that her body could not contain it. She was a woman who had spent her entire life controlling perceptions, managing outcomes, and building a flawless facade. And that facade had just been publicly and violently demolished. Not by a business rival, not by a market crash, but by an old, simple, useless man in a ridiculous apron. The humiliation was a physical, choking thing. Marcus stood by the fireplace, his arms hanging limp at his sides. He was still in his tuxedo, but he looked like a man who had just survived a car crash. His face was a pale, ashen mask of shame and a dawning, terrible clarity. He was looking at his wife, but he was seeing for the first time the true ugly and reckless core of her ambition. He was seeing the woman who had in her profound and deeply ignorant arrogance just sacrificed his career on the altar of her own social climbing. The silence stretched. And then it broke. Madison's head snapped toward him. Her eyes, which had been wide with shock, now narrowed into two cold reptilian slits. The beautiful, charming hostess was gone, burned away, leaving only this creature of pure, undiluted, and venomous rage. When she spoke, her voice was not the tinkling, bright sound he was used to. It was a low, vicious, and barely controlled hiss, a sound that was more terrifying than any scream. "Your father." Marcus did not respond. He just looked at her. "Your father." She finally shrieked the word, tearing out of her throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated fury. She snatched an empty champagne flute from a nearby table and hurled it at the white marble fireplace. It shattered with a sound like a gunshot, a spray of crystal shards. "He ruined it!" She screamed, her voice now a raw, ragged thing. "He ruined everything. My party, my connections, my entire year of planning gone, all of it." She was a whirlwind of rage pacing the room, her silver dress a blur, her hands clenched into claws. She was a woman who would not accept that this was her fault. The architect of her own disaster, she was now desperately searching for a saboteur, and she found one. "He did it on purpose," she hissed, spinning to face Marcus, her eyes wild. "Don't you see it? He planned this, the whole pathetic aw-shucks routine, the old humble music teacher. It was an act to humiliate me, to make me look like a fool in front of Harrison Davenport." She was rewriting the narrative in real time, her mind a frantic, desperate machine, turning her own cruelty into an act of self-defense. He knew Davenport was a jazz fan. He had to have. He saw me talking to him, and he waited. He waited for the perfect moment to walk over with his tray and his stupid servile apron and to steal him from me. "Madison, that's insane," Marcus whispered, his voice a dry, hoarse thing. "Insane!" She laughed, a high, hysterical sound. "Is it? He has always hated me, Marcus. He hates that you're successful. He hates that you're better than he ever was. He's a bitter, jealous old man, and he saw his one chance to ruin us, and he took it. She was a tornado, and he was standing in the eye of it. He destroyed your career, Marcus." She shrieked, her voice now breaking into a sob of pure, selfish rage. "Davenport, the promotion, it's gone. Don't you understand that old, senile, useless man just set your entire future on fire just to warm his own pathetic hands?" She stood there panting in the center of the ruined party, a queen in a kingdom of her own, making a kingdom of shattered glass and broken dreams. She looked at her husband, her face a mask of righteous fury, demanding that he join her in her rage, that he stand with her against the man who had, in Madison's shriek, "He destroyed your career, Marcus," was the final desperate grenade tossed into a room already decimated by her social war. She stood there panting, a beautiful, glittering, and utterly toxic creature, her face a mask of righteous fury. She was not just a woman in denial. She was a general who, having just led her army off a cliff, was now blaming the mountain for being in her way. She had presented her case, she was the victim, and my son was the co-victim. All that was left was for him to agree to join her in her rage, to unite with her against the common enemy, the useless old man who had somehow outsmarted them both. She was waiting for him to nod, to rage with her, to comfort her. But Marcus did not move. He stood by the cold white marble fireplace, a silent, solitary figure in a rumpled tuxedo. For the entire evening he had been a ghost, a supporting actor in his wife's production. He had been the dutiful, embarrassed son, the pained, supportive husband. He had been a man of profound and deeply cowardly inaction. His silence had been my son's betrayal. And now in the wreckage of his own party that silence continued. But it was a different kind of silence. It was no longer the silence of shame. It was the silence of a man processing a catastrophic, life-altering event. Marcus, Madison's voice was sharp now, a note of new and unfamiliar uncertainty in it. Did you hear me? He ruined you. My son. Marcus slowly, very slowly, lifted his head. He had been staring at the floor, at the shards of the champagne glass his wife had thrown. But now he looked at her. And the man who looked at her was not the man she had married. The soft, placating, and easily managed husband was gone. The adoration in his eyes, the look of a man who is perpetually and a little foolishly in awe of his beautiful, brilliant wife, had been extinguished. In its place was something new, something I had not seen in his eyes since he was a young, principled, and deeply passionate law student. A look of cold, hard, and devastating clarity. "No, Madison," he said. His voice was not a yell. It was not a shout of anger. It was a low, quiet, and utterly steady sound, a sound that cut through her hysteria like a surgeon's blade. He didn't ruin it. He took a step toward her, away from the fireplace, out of the shadows. I did. Madison stared at him, her mouth slightly open, a look of pure, uncomprehending confusion on her face. This was not the script. What are you talking about?" she stammered. "He's the one who made a scene. He's the one who humiliated us." "He didn't make a scene," Marcus said, his voice still that same terrible, quiet monotone. "He just sat down at a piano." "A piano he has played his entire life. I made the scene, Madison, by not having the courage to stop you." "Stop me!" she shrieked, her voice rising again, a new panicked, defensive tone. "Stop me from what? From throwing him a party, from giving him a gift." "A gift," he repeated, and he laughed, a short, bitter, and self-loathing sound. "You call that a gift? An apron that said, 'The Help.'" He looked at her, and the clarity in his eyes was now a bright, burning, and righteous anger, an anger directed not at her, but at himself. "I stood right there," he continued, his voice a low, brutal confession. "I stood right there, and I watched my wife, the woman I love, publicly, and with a cruelty that I did not know she possessed, humiliate my 72-year-old father. I watched her hand him a servant's apron. I watched her and a room full of people I am supposed to respect laugh at him. I watched the greatest and most decent man I have ever known put on that apron and pick up a tray and say nothing. And I—" He said, his voice now breaking with the sheer crushing weight of his own profound and irreversible shame. "I did nothing. I said nothing. I just stood here and I stared at my shoes." He looked at her, and all the love, all the adoration was gone, replaced by a look of pure, cold, and devastating pity. "He didn't ruin me, Madison." He whispered the words, a final damning verdict on their entire life together. "I ruined myself. I ruined myself the moment I let you believe that a man like him was a person to be ashamed of. I ruined myself the moment I chose your ambition over his honor." He looked at the ruined party, at the half-eaten food, at the broken glass. "And I ruined myself," he said, "by letting you give him that apron." The silence was back, but this time it was the silence of a man who had finally, and far too late, told the truth. The apartment was a mausoleum, a tomb for their dead ambitions. The silence that followed the departure of the last panicked guest was a heavy, suffocating thing. I imagine my son Marcus and his wife Madison were left standing in the wreckage of their perfect staged life. The half-eaten expensive canapes, the abandoned glasses of champagne, the silver-wrapped gift box with its humiliating apron, all of it was evidence of the catastrophe. They were no longer a power couple on the rise. They were the architects of their own, very public social ruin. The fight, the one where Madison had screamed and Marcus had finally brokenly found his voice, had left them shattered. Two separate shipwrecked survivors on an island of cold white marble. They would have gone to their separate corners. Madison, I imagine, would be in the master bathroom, scrubbing her face with a vicious, angry energy, as if she could wash away the humiliation, the pity, the contempt she had seen in the eyes of her guests. Marcus would be in his dark, silent study, a glass of my best scotch in his hand, staring at the blank, accusing screen of his computer. He would be replaying the entire horrifying evening frame by frame. He would be seeing his father's quiet, dignified smile as he tied on the apron. He would be seeing Harrison Davenport's face, the slow dawning comprehension, the look of profound and deeply personal disappointment. He would be hearing his own voice, his own silence, a silence that had in its inaction betrayed them both. He was a man who had failed a test he didn't even know he was taking. And now he was just waiting for the grade. The call came at 12:30 in the morning. The phone vibrating on the hard glass surface of his desk would have sounded like a bomb in the silent, oppressive darkness of the house. He would have looked at the screen, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. The name on the screen would be the one he had been dreading, Harrison Davenport. It was not a call he could ignore. This was not a social call. This was a summons. He would have answered, his hand trembling, his voice a dry, hoarse, and deeply unprofessional croak. Sir, Marcus Davenport's voice would be not angry, not loud, but cold, a deep, quiet, and utterly final cold. The voice of a man who has made a decision, a man who is no longer a mentor but a judge. I am so sorry about tonight, sir. Marcus would have stammered, his mind racing, trying to find the words, the excuse, the lie that could fix this. Madison, It was a joke, sir, a terrible, misguided... Stop! Davenport would have cut him off the single word, a blade of pure cold steel. Just stop! I am not calling about the party, Marcus. I am calling about you. Marcus would have been silent, his blood turning to ice. I had you on the fast track for a junior partnership. Davenport would continue, his voice a dispassionate, analytical murmur, as if he were discussing a failing stock. You're a brilliant lawyer, Marcus. You have a good mind for the work. But a partnership is not just about the work. It is about judgment. It is about character. It is about the ability to see the true value of an asset, to recognize a liability, to understand the human element of a situation. He would have paused, letting the silence stretch, a long, agonizing moment of professional execution. And tonight, Davenport would say, his voice full of a profound and deeply personal disappointment, you failed in a way I have not seen a man fail in 30 years of practice. You, a man who wants to be a partner at this firm, stood by silently and you allowed your wife to publicly humiliate a living legend. A man I and many of our firm's most important clients happen to revere. A man who is by some miracle your own father. Sir, Marcus would try to interrupt, but Davenport would cut him off again. I am not interested in your excuses, Marcus, he'd say. I am interested in the simple, undeniable fact. I cannot trust the judgment of a man who does not recognize the treasure he has in his own home. I cannot promote a man who, when faced with a simple test of character, of loyalty, of basic human decency, chooses to stare at his shoes. The promotion is off the table, Marcus. We will reevaluate your position at the firm in the morning. The line would go dead. Click. The sound of his future, his ambition, his entire carefully constructed life being hung up on. He would be left in the dark with nothing but the echo of his boss's final devastating verdict and the dawning, horrifying realization that his wife had not just humiliated his father. She had, in a single, stupid, and arrogant act, just destroyed them both. The call didn't just end. It was a termination. The soft, final click of Harrison Davenport hanging up the phone was the sound of a steel door slamming shut, locking my son in a prison of his own making. Marcus, I know, would have been left in the dark of his study, the phone still pressed to his ear, listening to the dead, empty sound of the dial tone. He would be frozen, the words "reevaluate your position," echoing in the silence, a polite, corporate, and utterly devastating euphemism for "you are finished." The promotion was not just a title, it was not just a larger office with a better view. It was the entire load-bearing wall of their financial life. It was the linchpin, and it had just been pulled. Marcus and Madison were not just wealthy. They were a performance of wealth. They were a high-wire act performed without a net. They were living as so many in their world do, on the promise of a future income. The new higher salary, the massive junior partner bonus, these were not extra money. They were already spent. They had been spent months ago, factored into a budget that was already strained to the breaking point. I can picture my son, the brilliant corporate lawyer, a man who built his career on risk assessment finally, and far too late assessing his own. He would have turned on his desk lamp, the single harsh light illuminating a stack of bills. The lease on the glass and marble house, a sum that was obscene. The payments on their 2 luxury cars, a matching set of identical sterile and deeply unnecessary German SUVs. The quarterly dues for the country club Madison insisted they belonged to a place they rarely went, but where being seen was apparently worth the price of a small car. And then the credit cards. The American Express Platinum, the Black Card. A stack of them all carrying balances that would make a normal man faint, balances that were the result of Madison's event planning business. A business that was, I had always suspected, more of an expensive hobby, a way to justify her endless, extravagant spending on clothes, on dinners, on the very party that had just destroyed them. They were leveraged to the hilt, a beautiful modern building with a foundation made of shifting sand. And the tide had just with a single phone call gone out. He would have opened a spreadsheet. A lawyer like Marcus would have a spreadsheet for everything. And he would have done the math. He would have looked at his current, now unchanged salary, and he would have looked at their monthly burn rate, the amount of money that bled from their accounts just to keep this performance, this illusion of their perfect lives afloat. And for the first time, he would have seen the truth in the cold, hard, and undeniable language of numbers. The numbers did not add up. They were not just in trouble. They were underwater. They were in the most profound and terrifying way ruined. This was the true and most terrible consequence of my humiliation. The apron, the help, was not just a cruel social blunder. It was a multi-million-dollar mistake. It was the single arrogant and breathtakingly stupid act that had just bankrupted them. The irony was so perfect, so complete, that it was almost a work of art. Madison, in her desperate, shallow attempt to secure their financial future by impressing Harrison Davenport, had in her profound ignorance insulted the one thing in the world he truly valued. She had not just failed to impress him. She had revealed to him a flaw in her own and in her husband's character, a flaw so deep and so rotten that he could no longer in good conscience reward them with the power of a partnership. Marcus would have sat there in the dark, the spreadsheet glowing on his screen, a digital testament to his own ruin. And the anger he had felt toward his wife, the brief, righteous flash of clarity, would have been consumed by a new and far more powerful emotion, pure, cold, and abject terror. He was a man who had lost his king's favor, and in his world a man without his king's favor is a man without a future. He would have known with a sickening certainty that he could not fix this. He could not email his way out of this. He could not reevaluate his way out of this. The decision was final. There was only one person in the world who could perhaps intercede on his behalf. One person who had the ear of the king. One person who in the span of a single evening had gone from a charity case to the most influential man in his life. The useless old man. The help. He would have to go to his father, not for forgiveness, not for love, but for a bailout. A social and professional bailout. The humiliation he was about to learn had only just begun. I did not return to their house. How could I? After that night, after Harrison Davenport and his young associates had driven me to a quiet old jazz club that smelled of bourbon and history, I had known I could not go back. I did not belong in that cold, white marble gallery. So I had returned to my own apartment, the small, rent-controlled place near the conservatory that I had kept for 40 years. I had kept it as a studio, a place to practice my trumpet without bothering anyone, a sanctuary. Madison had hated it. She had always been pressuring me to give it up, to stop wasting money. But I had kept it. And now it had become my lifeboat. I spent the next 3 days in a state of quiet, profound, and deeply peaceful solitude. I sat in my old, worn leather armchair, the one that smelled of my late wife Grace and old smoked tobacco. I listened to my records. Miles, Coltrane, Monk. I played my own horn, the notes, a low, quiet, mournful sound in the small, book-lined room. I did not answer the frantic, increasingly desperate text messages from my son. I was a ghost. I was as Madison had so cruelly wished gone. The knock on my door came just after midnight on the 3rd day. It was not a polite, civilized knock. It was a frantic, desperate, a rhythmic pounding, the sound of a man who is drowning. A man who is beating his fists against the side of a ship that has already left the harbor. I knew who it was. I sat for a long moment, the quiet, beautiful notes of a Bill Evans trio hanging in the air. Then I put my trumpet down and I went to the door. I opened it, and my son Marcus almost fell into the room. He was not the sharp-tailored and confident corporate lawyer I had seen at the party. This was a different man, a man I had never seen before. His expensive bespoke suit was rumpled as if he had been sleeping in it for 3 days. His silk tie was gone, his collar open. His face was pale, unshaven, and his eyes were red-rimmed, wild, and utterly, completely broken. He smelled of sweat and expensive sour scotch. He stumbled into my small apartment, a room he had always been too busy to visit, and he looked around dazed as if he had just woken up in a foreign country. He looked at the shelves overflowing with books and records, at the old upright piano in the corner, at the framed pictures of me with Dizzy Gillespie, with Sarah Vaughan. He was seeing for the first time the geography of a life he had never bothered to know. "Dad," he whispered, and the word was a raw, broken, unfamiliar thing in his mouth. He did not look at me. He looked at the photos. He knew them. He murmured, his voice a dazed, uncomprehending whisper. "Davenport. He saw your pictures. He knew them." He turned to me, his eyes wide with a terrible new and deeply cynical understanding. "All this time, I thought—" He couldn't finish. He collapsed into the old worn armchair, the one that had been Grace's, and he put his face in his soft lawyer's hands. A sound came out of him that I had not heard since he was a small boy who had fallen from his bicycle and broken his arm. A deep, ragged, and utterly broken sob. "He called me Dad." He finally choked out, his voice muffled by his hands. "Davenport. He called me. That night, after you left." He looked up, his eyes swimming in a mixture of raw terror and a profound, agonizing shame. "It's over," he whispered. "The partnership, the promotion, my future. It's all gone." He said he can't trust the judgment of a man who doesn't recognize the treasure he has in his own home. The words "treasure in his own home" hung in the air between us. He had finally understood. "He was talking about you, Dad," he wept. "All this time I let her. I was ashamed. I was ashamed of your music, of your past. I thought it made me look small. I thought a man like Davenport only respected power, only respected money." He laughed, a short, bitter, ugly sound. "And the whole time, the whole damn time, you were the power. Your music, your life. That was the only thing he really, truly respected." He was on his knees then, on the old worn Persian rug, grabbing the front of my shirt. "You have to fix this, Dad." He pleaded, his voice a frantic, urgent thing. "You have to call him. You're his friend now. He worships you. You can explain, tell him it was a mistake. Tell him it was Madison. Blame her, I don't care. Tell him she's crazy, that I was trapped. Tell him it won't happen again. He'll listen to you. He respects you. Please, Dad, please. My life is over if you don't." He was weeping, the great, powerful corporate lawyer weeping on the floor of my small, humble apartment, begging for his life. But he was not here to apologize. He was not here to beg for my forgiveness. He was here to beg for my influence. He was not here to mend the bridge between a father and a son. He was here to get me to repair the bridge between him and his boss. He still didn't get it. He still saw me as a tool, a different kind of tool now. Not a shameful burden, but a useful, powerful connection, a key. He had simply traded one form of using me for another. And as I looked down at him, at my son, my broken, weeping, and utterly blind son, the last lingering embers of my hope for him turned to cold, hard, and final ash. He knelt on the floor of my small, crowded apartment, my son, a 42-year-old man weeping like a lost child. He was a corporate lawyer, a man who commanded 6-figure fees, a man who lived in a house of glass and marble. And he was on his knees on my worn 20-year-old Persian rug, his soft, manicured hands clutching the fabric of my simple wool trousers. "Please, Dad?" He begged, his voice a thick, ugly, and broken sound. "You have to fix this. You're the only one who can. Call him. Call Davenport. He respects you. He worships you. You can explain it to him. Tell him it was Madison. It was all her. She's crazy. She's obsessed with this stuff. I didn't know about the apron, I swear. I was just I was trapped. Tell him that. He'll listen to you. I looked down at the top of his head at his expensive, perfectly cut hair now damp with sweat and tears, and I felt nothing. The last lingering and profoundly foolish embers of my hope for him, the hope that this humiliation might have somehow sparked a change in him, had just been extinguished. I was a fool to have even hoped. He was not here to apologize. He was not here to atone for his silence, for his profound and deeply public betrayal of his own father. He was here to negotiate. He was here to cut a deal. He was offering me a trade. He would throw his wife under the bus in exchange for me saving his career. He still didn't get it. He still saw the world as a series of transactions of levers to be pulled. He had simply discovered that the old, useless tool he had once discarded me had suddenly become the only tool in the box that mattered, and he was here to use it. I placed my hand on his head, not in a gesture of comfort, but with the quiet, firm finality of a judge. "Get up, Marcus," I said, my voice not loud, but clear and cold and sharp. It cut through his weeping, and he froze. "Get up." Slowly, unsteadily, he pushed himself up from the floor, a puppet whose strings had just been cut. He stumbled back and collapsed into the old, worn leather armchair that had been his mother's favorite. He looked at me, his face a ruin, his eyes a mixture of terror and a new, dawning, confused hope. He thought my command meant I was about to help him. He thought the negotiation was about to begin. I shook my head, a slow, single, and final gesture of negation. "I am not going to call him Marcus," I said. The small, fragile hope in his eyes died, replaced by a raw, uncomprehending panic. What do you mean?" he stammered. "You have to. He'll fire me. I'll be ruined." "No," I said, and I walked to the window, looking out at the quiet, honest, and unpretentious street below. "You are already ruined, Marcus. You just don't understand the nature of your own ruin. You think this is about a job. You think this is about a promotion you lost." I turned to face him, this stranger who was my son. "This is not about your job. This is about your soul." My soul," he repeated the word, a foreign, meaningless sound in his mouth. "Yes," I said. "You come in here, you weep on my floor, and you beg me to fix this. And in the very same breath you blame your wife. Tell him it was Madison. Tell him she's crazy. You are still doing it, Marcus. You are still hiding. You are still refusing to see the truth. She is crazy," he cried, his voice a desperate, childish wail. "She's the one who handed you the apron." "Yes," I said, my voice as cold and as hard as the steel of my trumpet. "She handed me the apron. She was cruel. She was ignorant. She was ambitious. But she is not the one who broke my heart, Marcus." He stared at me, his eyes wide with a terrible dawning comprehension. "You did." I said the words, a quiet, simple, and utterly final verdict. "You with your silence, you with your averted gaze, you with your decision to stand by that fireplace and stare at your shoes while your wife publicly and with a terrible, calculated cruelty humiliated your father. She was the one who lit the match. But you, Marcus, you were the one who stood there and watched my dignity burn. That is the problem." He had no answer. There was no answer. There was only the truth, a truth that had been waiting unspoken between us for his entire adult life. "I cannot fix this for you, Marcus," I said, and my voice was softer now, not with pity, but with a profound and weary sadness. "This is your work, not mine. The problem here is not your job. The problem is your wife, the woman you have chosen, a woman who is a hollow, empty, and morally bankrupt creature. A woman who would and did sacrifice my honor for the chance to impress a man she did not even know." I let the words land, a series of precise, surgical, and deeply painful incisions. "And the other problem," I said, "is your silence. The part of you that is so terrified of her, so desperate for her approval, so addicted to the shallow, glittering life she has built for you that you were willing to trade your own father for it." I looked at my son, my broken, weeping, and utterly lost son. "I cannot call Harrison Davenport and fix that," I said. "That is a wound that only you can heal, or not. The choice, as it has always been, is yours." I let my final words, "The problem is your wife and your silence," hang in the air of the small, quiet apartment. They were not an accusation. They were a diagnosis, a final structural report on a lifetime of failure. He knelt on the floor, this 42-year-old man who was my son, and the sound of his weeping changed. It was no longer the frantic, panicked sob of a man trying to save his job. It was something deeper, something hollower, the sound of a man who has just been truly and irrevocably seen. He looked up at me, his face a ruin of shame and confusion. "But what am I supposed to do?" He whispered, his voice a raw, broken plea. "She's my wife. It's my life. I love her." "Do you?" I asked, and the question was genuine, not rhetorical. "Do you love her? Or do you love the life she represents? Do you love the idea of her? The beautiful, blonde, ambitious woman who helped you escape the old, boring world of your father?" I walked over to my small, scarred piano, the one I had played my whole life, the one that had been in our home when he was a boy. I ran my hand over the worn ivory keys. "For your entire adult life, Marcus," I said, "you have been trying to live in two different worlds, my world and hers." I turned to face him. "My world," I said, gesturing to the shelves of books, the stacks of old records, the worn-out trumpet case in the corner, "is a world of substance, of hard work, of quiet dignity, a world where a man's worth is measured by the integrity of his craft, by the truth in his music. It is the world your mother Grace and I built for you, a world where honor is the foundation." I then looked past him as if I could see her cold white marble house right through the wall. "And then," I continued, "there is her world, Madison's world." The name hung in the air, a cold, sharp sound. "It is a beautiful, glittering, and hollow world, a world of glass and surfaces, a world of networking and appearances and performance, a world where a man's worth is measured only by his proximity to power, by the title on his business card, a world where a 72-year-old father, a man who has dedicated his life to his art, is seen as a simple old fool, a charity case, a prop to be dressed up in a servant's apron and used to demonstrate her own false generosity." I looked at him, my gaze unwavering. "You have been trying to be a citizen of both worlds, son. You have been trying to be my son and her husband. And on Saturday night, in front of God and Harrison Davenport and everyone else, we all saw that it is impossible. You cannot stand on two foundations at once. A structure, Marcus, cannot have two conflicting foundations. It will inevitably collapse." He had no answer. He just stared at me, the truth of my words a blueprint for his own broken life. "This is not about your job anymore," I said. "This is not about your promotion. This is about your foundation. Harrison Davenport is not the problem. He is just the mirror. He is a man from my world, a man of substance who looked at you and saw a man of surfaces, a man who would not or could not defend his own father, a man with no honor. And he found that disappointing, because he cannot trust a man who has no foundation." I let the words land. I let them sit in the quiet, jazz-filled room. "So you have a choice," I said, my voice a quiet, final verdict. "You can continue to live in her world, the world of bright, empty, and hollow things, a world where you will always be a supporting actor in her performance, a world where you must be ashamed of who you are and where you come from. Or you can choose to find your way back to this one." "And if I do," he whispered, his voice a raw, broken plea, "if I—" "What? What do you want me to do?" "I want you to become the man your mother and I raised," I said. "I cannot fix your career. That is your own mess to clean up. But your soul, that is what is at stake. You must choose the shiny, hollow, and cowardly life she wants for you, or the difficult, honest, and respectful life that I taught you. The choice is yours. But you cannot ever again have both." I walked to the door of my apartment and opened it. The smell of the old, dusty hallway, a simple, unpretentious smell, drifted in. "I am not calling Harrison Davenport," I said, my voice firm. "That is your problem. But your bigger problem is the woman you are going to go home to, and until you solve that problem, you and I have nothing left to talk about." I stepped back, holding the door open. It was a final, quiet, and loving act of eviction. He looked at me, his face a mask of utter, terrified desolation. Then slowly, unsteadily, he got to his feet, a broken man, and walked out into the hallway to choose his future. I don't remember the walk out of my father's apartment building. I don't remember the elevator ride or the walk through the lobby. My first clear memory is of standing on the dark city street, the cold midnight air, a shock against my tear-stained, overheated face. The door had closed behind me, a soft final click that had echoed the sound of Harrison Davenport's phone call. 2 doors had closed on my life in one night. 2 men, the 2 men I respected most in the world, my boss and my father, had both in their own quiet and devastatingly similar ways found me wanting. My father's words were a relentless looping soundtrack in my head. The problem is your wife. The problem is your silence. You cannot have both. He had offered me a choice, a terrible, impossible choice between the woman I loved and the man I had too late realized I respected. I drove home in a daze, the city lights a blur of meaningless color. I was a man walking on a foundation that had just been revealed to be nothing but a thin sheet of ice, and it was cracking beneath my feet. When I got back to the house, all the lights were on. The cold white marble and glass box was lit up like a department store, a beacon of our anxious, expensive life. I walked in and Madison was there waiting for me in the living room. She was not the furious, screaming woman from the night of the party. She was a different and far more dangerous creature. She was a general waiting for a battlefield report. "Well?" she asked, her voice a sharp, impatient, and deeply unattractive sound. She was in a silk robe, a glass of wine in her hand. She had been waiting for me to come home with good news, with a solution. "Did you fix it? Did you talk to him? Did he call Davenport?" I looked at her, at my beautiful, ambitious wife, and for the first time I saw her clearly. I saw her through my father's eyes. I saw her through Harrison Davenport's eyes. She was not a partner. She was an adversary. "He's not going to call him," I said, my voice a flat, dead thing. I sank into one of the white, uncomfortable chairs, the ones my father had hated, and I put my head in my hands. "What do you mean he's not going to call him?" she snapped, her voice rising, the thin veneer of her confidence cracking. "What did you do, Marcus? Did you even ask him?" "Yes, I asked him," I said, my voice muffled by my hands. "I begged him." "And," she demanded, walking to stand over me. "And he said no," I said, looking up at her, my face a ruin of my own profound shame. He said the problem wasn't my job. He said the problem was you and my silence." I said the words, and in saying them I realized the full, terrible, and unassailable truth of them. Madison stared at me for a long, silent moment. She was processing, and then she laughed. It was not the bright, tinkling social laugh I was used to. It was a short, sharp, ugly bark of pure, unadulterated contempt. "My God," she said, her voice a low, vicious hiss. "You are pathetic." I flinched as if she had slapped me. "He's right." She continued, her eyes as cold and as hard as the marble floor. "He's right about you. You are a coward. I send you there to fix this, to save our lives, to use the one single piece of leverage we have over that old man, and what do? You let him, a senile old has-been, blame me. You let him win. You just sat there and you let him, just like you did at the party. You are weak, Marcus. You are just as weak and just as pathetic and just as useless as he is." And that was it. That was the moment. The final, fatal click of the gears falling into place. Useless. The word she had used about my father. The word she was now using about me. She was the common denominator. She was the poison. My father's words, "You have to choose," echoed in my head. And in that single, clarifying, and deeply, terribly liberating moment of pure, cold clarity, I did. I stood up from the chair. I was no longer the broken, weeping child from my father's apartment. I was just a man who was very, very tired. "You're right," I said, and my voice was a quiet, new, and unfamiliar sound. It was the sound of my own long-forgotten foundation. "What?" she said, confused, her angry tirade cut short. "You're right," I repeated, walking past her towards the foyer. "He is right, and you are right. I am weak. I have been. I have been weak for 10 years. I've been weak every time I let you buy something we couldn't afford, every time I let you make a casually cruel remark about my family, every time I stayed silent when you disrespected the man who gave me my life." I reached the front door. I put my hand on the cold steel handle. "And I've been weak," I said, turning to look at her one last time. "Every time I chose you and this cold, empty, and hollow life over him, and over myself." "Marcus?" she said, her voice a small, uncertain, and suddenly very frightened sound. "What are you doing?" "I'm making a choice," I said. "I'm choosing, and I'm choosing him." I opened the door, walked out into the hallway, and I did not look back. I had just lost my job, my promotion, my wife, and my home. And for the first time in my entire adult life, I was not ashamed. I was finally and completely free. I did not hear from my son for a full month. The silence that had once been a weapon, a space I had filled with my own quiet resolve, was now just a silence. I did not know what choice he had made, where he had gone, or what had become of him. He had walked out of my apartment, a broken man, a king without a kingdom, and he had vanished. I continued my life. I practiced my horn. I listened to my records. I sat in my quiet apartment and I waited not for him, but for something. For the next note in the song. The knock on my door when it came was not the frantic, desperate pounding of a man in a panic. It was a soft, hesitant, almost shy knock. A sound so quiet I almost thought I had imagined it. I opened the door. It was Marcus. He was not the rumpled, scotch-soaked, broken man I had seen a month ago, and he was not the slick, arrogant corporate lawyer from the party. This was a third man, a stranger. He was dressed in a simple pair of jeans and a plain gray sweater. His face was thin, and there were dark circles under his eyes, but his eyes, they were clear. For the first time in 10 years, they were clear. He was not carrying a briefcase. He was holding 2 simple cardboard cups of coffee. He did not speak. He did not say, "I'm sorry." He did not say, "I've left her." He simply looked at me, and in his eyes I saw not the complicated, fearful, and deeply ashamed gaze of her husband, but the simple, quiet, and profoundly lost gaze of my son. He held out one of the coffee cups to me, a peace offering, a down payment. I was in the neighborhood, he said, his voice a low, rough thing. I remembered you liked it black with 1 sugar. I took the coffee from his hand. Our fingers brushed. It was the first time we had touched in, I could not remember how long. Thank you, son, I whispered. I stepped aside and let him in. He walked into my small, cluttered apartment, this room that was the antithesis of the cold marble and glass world he had chosen. He looked at the stacks of records at the shelves, overflowing with books, at the framed photo of his mother Grace laughing by the piano. He looked at it all not as a stranger, not as a tourist, but as a man who was finally, and after a long and terrible journey home. He sat down, not in the armchair, but on the small, worn ottoman, a humble, almost reverent gesture, and I sat in my old leather chair. We did not talk. Not about Madison. Not about Davenport. Not about the promotion or the money or the terrible gaping wound of the party. We just sat. We sat in the quiet, sun-drenched apartment and we drank our coffee. And the silence for the first time was not a weapon. It was not a void. It was a space to heal. He looked at the trumpet case in the corner. I haven't heard you play in a long time, Dad, he said, his voice quiet. I thought you didn't like it. I replied the words a simple statement of fact, not an accusation. I thought, he set his eyes on the floor, that it didn't matter. I thought it was just a hobby, something from the past. I didn't know that it mattered. To people like him. He could not yet say Davenport's name. It was too soon. It mattered to me, I said softly. It always mattered to me, and it mattered to your mother. He nodded, his throat working. And then he did something I had been waiting for him to do his entire adult life. He stopped talking, and he just listened. He listened to the quiet ticking clocks. He listened to the distant musical sound of the city traffic. He listened to the silence between us. He had not come here to apologize. He had not come here to ask for anything. He had come here, I realized, to do the one thing he had never in his frantic, ambitious, and deeply hollow life ever done before. He had come here to be quiet. He had come here to listen. The weeks that followed were a new and quiet education. Marcus would come to my small apartment not with the frantic, desperate energy of a man seeking a favor, but with the quiet, humble posture of a student. He would bring coffee and sometimes a bag of pastries from a small neighborhood bakery. We would sit in the 2 worn armchairs in my living room, the one that had been mine and the one that had been Grace's, and we would be. He did not speak of Madison. I did not ask. I learned later through the quiet grapevine of the city that she had filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences, her pride too great to admit that her husband had simply walked away. And Marcus, I learned, had not contested it. He had, with a quiet and devastating finality, agreed to all her terms, given her the house, the cars, everything. He had walked away with nothing but a suitcase and his own profound and newly discovered sense of self. He had, in a quiet and deeply personal way, chosen. He had chosen my world, a world of substance over a world of surfaces. Our visits were not filled with conversation. The past was a minefield, a landscape of shared unspoken pain that we were both too wounded and too proud to navigate. He would not and could not apologize for his silence at the party, and I would not and could not offer him an easy forgiveness. The wound was too deep, the betrayal too profound. So we sat. And in the silence between us, a silence that was no longer hostile but simply sad, I found myself doing something I had not done in a very, very long time. One evening, as he sat in his mother's chair staring at the floor, a man adrift in the wreckage of his own life, I stood up. I walked to the corner of the room, to the old battered leather-bound case that held my oldest and dearest friend. I opened the latches, the soft metallic click, a sound that was as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. I took out my trumpet. It was an old, beautiful silver horn, its lacquer worn thin in the places where my hands had held it for 50 years. Marcus looked up, his eyes full of a strange, new, and unfamiliar curiosity. I had not played for him, not really played, since he was a small boy. In his adult, ambitious corporate world, my music, my art had been a quaint and slightly embarrassing hobby. I did not speak. I simply put the mouthpiece to my lips, closed my eyes, and I began to play. I did not play a loud, triumphant, or angry song. I played a blues. A slow, quiet, and deeply mournful blues, the kind of music that is born not in the mind, but in the soul. I played the sound of a 72-year-old man's heart. I played the sound of my grief for grace. I played the sound of my betrayal by my son. I played the sound of the help of a lifetime of quiet indignities, of a pride that had been wounded but had never ever broken. The notes were low and soft and full of a quiet, aching pain. They were the most honest words I had spoken in months. Marcus did not move. He just sat, his head bowed, and he listened. And I knew as I played that for the first time in his entire privileged and deeply sheltered life, my son was truly hearing me. He was not just hearing the notes, he was hearing the meaning. He was hearing the 50 years of struggle, of joy, of pain, of a life lived with honor in a world that had not always been honorable to a man like me. He was hearing the voice of the father he had never bothered to know. He was hearing the story of the simple old man he had been so ashamed of. When I finished the last mournful blue note hanging in the air, a final unresolved question, the silence in the room was different. It was no longer an empty void. It was full. It was full of our shared history, of our shared and unspoken pain. Marcus looked up at me. His eyes, his lawyer's eyes, his ambitious, calculating eyes were swimming in tears. They were not the tears of self-pity. They were not the tears of a man who had lost his job. They were the tears of a man who had just for the first time truly and with a heartbreaking clarity seen his own father. He did not speak. He did not need to. The music had said it all. The ice, the great frozen and silent glacier that had been between us for 20 years, had finally, with a single mournful blue note, begun to crack. The weeks after Marcus walked out of my apartment were a new kind of quiet. Our weekly visits continued, but the silence between us was different. It was no longer the silence of shame and anger. It was a shared silence, a comfortable working silence, the silence of two men who are beginning slowly and with great care to rebuild a foundation that had been completely demolished. He would bring coffee and I would put on a record, an old blue note pressing, Art Blakey, Horace Silver, and we would just listen. He would listen to the music and I would watch him. I saw a change in him. The frantic, hunted energy of the failed lawyer was gone. The soft, arrogant, and deeply insecure man who had been my daughter-in-law's husband was also gone. This new man was quieter. He was more thoughtful. He was for the first time in his life truly and deeply listening. One afternoon, about a month after he had left his wife, I was sitting in my armchair reading when a thick, cream-colored envelope was slid under my door. It was not a bill. It was not a piece of junk mail. It was heavy, expensive, and it had the embossed return address of a powerful downtown law firm. Peterson, Croft and Maxwell. It was from Harrison Davenport. My heart, a quiet, steady 72-year-old machine, gave a small, irregular beat. I had not spoken to the man since the night of the party, the night we had shared a quiet, respectful brandy in a jazz club, a night that now felt like it had happened in a different lifetime. I opened the letter. It was not a legal document. It was a personal note written on his own private monogram stationery in a strong, confident, and very clear hand. "Dear Professor Bishop," it began. Not Julius, not Jules, but Professor. A title of profound and deeply felt respect. "I must begin by apologizing," he wrote, "for the unconscionable delay in my correspondence. The events of that evening at your son's home have weighed heavily on my mind. I was and am profoundly embarrassed by the display of disrespect you were forced to endure. It was a failure of character not just on the part of your daughter-in-law, but on the part of every guest in that room, myself included, who did not immediately and forcefully object. I had to pause, my eyes blurring slightly. This man, this titan of industry, was apologizing to me. But this letter," he continued, "is not just an apology, it is a proposition. As you know, my passion for the music you helped to create is the great joy of my life. Your work at the Ellington Conservatory has been an inspiration to me and to my son for decades. I have been in communication with the board of the conservatory, and I have just finalized the creation of a new endowment, a $25 million fund dedicated to providing full 4-year scholarships for underprivileged, gifted young musicians, a fund that will be named the Julius Jules Bishop Endowment for American Music." I stopped breathing. $25 million. My name. It was not a gift. It was a legacy. A legacy I had never asked for, a legacy I had never known I was building. "I would be deeply and personally honored," he wrote, "if you would agree to serve as the honorary chairman of the fund. Your name, your guidance, and your unimpeachable integrity would be the foundation upon which we hope to build this new future for the music we both love." I sat there, the heavy cream-colored paper trembling in my hands, and then I saw it. A final paragraph, a postscript added at the bottom. "P.S." he had written. "Your son Marcus came to see me last week. He did not come to ask for his promotion back. He did not come to make excuses. He came simply to apologize. He apologized not for his wife, but for himself, for his own silence. He called it a failure of character, a phrase which I found to be both accurate and deeply honorable. He has tendered his resignation. I have for the moment refused to accept it. A man who is willing to look at his own deepest flaws with that kind of honesty is a rare and valuable thing. He is a good man, Professor. You have raised a good man. He just got lost. I believe he is finally finding his way back." I folded the letter, my hands shaking. I looked at the trumpet case in the corner and at the picture of Grace, my wife, on the piano. And for the first time in a very long, very dark, and very lonely year, I felt the unmistakable and deeply welcome warmth of tears. My son had not just left his wife. He had begun the long, hard, and deeply honorable work of coming home. While my son Marcus was beginning the slow, difficult, and deeply personal work of rebuilding his foundation, the woman who had built her entire life on a foundation of sand was experiencing a different kind of collapse, a total one. I did not see Madison's downfall. I did not need to. I had been in this city for 50 years. I understood the quiet, brutal, and efficient machinery of its social world. And Madison, a woman who lived and died by that world, was about to be devoured by it. Her life with Marcus was not a partnership. It was a performance. And that performance was predicated on two things: his rising star at the prestigious law firm and her own carefully curated image as one of the city's most exclusive and sought-after event planners. Her entire business model was based on her access, on her proximity to people like Harrison Davenport. She was not just an event planner, she was a social gatekeeper. And at my birthday party, she had not just insulted an old musician, she had in a single catastrophic act of public hubris slammed the gate on her own manicured fingers. The news of that night would have spread through the wealthy, insulated circles of Atlanta with the speed of a wildfire. It was a story too good, too juicy, too full of a perfect poetic justice not to be told. It would have been shared in hushed, delighted whispers over $1,000 lunches and on the velvet-gloved phone lines of the city's elite. Did you hear what happened at the Sterling party? She put the Julius Bishop in an apron. Harrison Davenport walked out, took all the young partners with him. Can you imagine the ignorance, the arrogance? She was not just a bad hostess, she was a fool. And in her world, being a fool is a far greater sin than being cruel. Her brand, the entire glittering edifice of her professional identity, was built on her flawless taste, her perfect connections, and her unimpeachable understanding of power. And in one night she had proven to her entire client base that she had none of those things. She had proven that she could not tell the difference between a national treasure and a servant. The fallout would have been immediate, and it would have been silent. There would be no angry phone calls, just a quiet, sudden, and complete cessation of all business. The phone in her beautiful all-white home office would simply stop ringing. The clients who had once been desperate for her services, the wealthy wives of doctors and bankers who had booked her for their charity galas and debutante balls, would suddenly, and without explanation, postpone their events. We've decided to go in a different direction, Madison. Something has come up. We'll be in touch. And then the final killing blow. Marcus left. When he walked out of that cold marble house, he did not just take his suitcase. He took her name. He took her legitimacy. He took her access to the one thing that had given her any power at all, his connection to Harrison Davenport. Without him, she was no longer Madison Sterling, the brilliant, ambitious wife of the firm's rising star. She was just Madison, a divorced event planner with a reputation for publicly and with a spectacular lack of judgment humiliating her own family. She was no longer a gatekeeper. She was a pariah. I can picture her alone in that vast, empty, and deathly quiet house. The house she had won in the divorce, a hollow, expensive, and deeply ironic prize. She would be surrounded by her beautiful, minimalist furniture, her abstract art, her perfect, tasteless, and utterly joyless world. The parties were over, the clients were gone, the husband was gone. She was a queen in a kingdom of one, a kingdom of glass and marble and a crushing, echoing silence. She had called my father-in-law a charity case, and now she was the one who was truly and completely bankrupt. 6 months. In my world, it is the time it takes to truly master a difficult piece of music, to internalize its changes, to understand its soul. In my son's world, it was the time it took for a life to be completely and painstakingly rebuilt. The divorce from Madison was a quiet, brutal, and fast affair. She had, in her rage, tried to fight him to claim a larger share of their assets, but she had made a fatal mistake. She had threatened a man whose new and only ally was Harrison Davenport. And Davenport, a man who did not forgive insults to his heroes, had quietly and with the surgical precision of a master litigator made it known that if she did not accept a simple, quiet, and deeply unfavorable settlement, he would personally ensure that the story of the help apron was a front-page feature in the city's social columns. She had signed the papers, taken what was left of their shared hollow assets, and she had quite simply disappeared. Tonight was not about her. It was not about what was lost. It was about what was being built. I was not in my small, quiet apartment. I was in a place that felt more like home to me than any marble and glass house ever could. I was backstage at the Blue Note, the legendary Atlanta Jazz Club, a small, dark, and beautiful room that smelled of old bourbon, spilled beer, and a lifetime of good music. The room was packed, sold out. There was an electric humming energy in the air, a sense of anticipation that was so thick you could almost touch it. This was not a party. This was a communion. Tonight was the official launch of the Julius Jules Bishop Endowment for American Music. It was a fundraiser, a celebration. And for the first time in almost 20 years, I had agreed to perform a full public set. I stood in the wings, my old silver trumpet in my hand, its metal warm familiar. I felt the familiar cold flicker of stage fright, a feeling I had missed, a feeling that reminded me I was alive. Harrison Davenport was at the front table, not as a titan of industry, but as a fan, his eyes fixed on the stage, a look of pure, unadulterated joy on his face. The club owner stepped up to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice a low, gravelly growl, We have a true living legend in the house tonight. A man whose music has been the soundtrack to our city for 50 years. A master, a teacher, a giant. Please put your hands together for the one, the only Professor Julius Bishop. The applause was not the polite, scattered, and deeply uncomfortable sound from my birthday party. It was a roar, a wave of pure, genuine, and deeply felt love and respect. It washed over me as I walked out onto the small, bright stage. I did not speak. I did not bow. I simply lifted my horn, the instrument that was my true voice, the voice that had never lied, never faltered. I put the mouthpiece to my lips, and I played. I played the music of my soul. I played the blues for grace. I played the complex, angry, and beautiful chords of Monk. I played the long, soaring, and hopeful lines of Coltrane. I played the sound of a 72-year-old man who had lost his wife, who had been betrayed by his son, who had been humiliated by a woman who saw him as a servant, and who had through it all held on to the one simple and unshakable truth of his own dignity. I played my story. And this room full of strangers, of music, lovers, of people who understood the language of the soul, they listened. They understood. They were not just hearing a performance. They were hearing a testament. When the last note of Midnight Blue faded into the smoky, reverent silence, there was a beat, a pause, a single shared breath. And then the room exploded. The applause, the shouts, the love, it was a physical thing, a wave that lifted me up. I bowed my eyes, stinging, and in that moment I was not a charity case. I was not the help. I was a king in my own true and everlasting kingdom. The final note, a high, clear, and perfectly sustained C, hung in the smoky, silent air of the club, a single perfect point of light in the darkness. I held it for a long, long moment, a testament to a lifetime of discipline, of breath control, of work. And then I let it go. The silence that followed was a profound and deeply respectful thing. It was not the awkward, horrified silence of my birthday party. It was the silence of a room full of people who had been on a journey, who had been moved, who had truly and deeply listened. And then the applause came. It was not a polite, scattered sound. It was a roar, a wave of pure, genuine, and deeply felt love, a sound that washed over the stage over me. And it felt like a homecoming. It felt like absolution. I bowed a deep and humble gesture, my old trumpet held at my side. I looked out into the crowd, and I saw them. I saw Harrison Davenport at his front table, on his feet, his eyes shining, his hands clapping above his head. He was not a CEO, he was not a lawyer, he was a fan, a man who had been touched by the music, by the story. And I saw the other faces, the faces of my city, the people who had come out to support the music, to support the future of the art form that I had given my life to. And in that moment, I was not an old, useless man. I was not a charity case. I was Professor Julius Bishop. And I was in this room, in this world, a king. My set was over. The next band, a group of young, brilliant kids from the conservatory, the very kids the new endowment would support, took the stage. I walked off, my horn in my hand, my heart full. I walked through the crowded, buzzing room, past the tables of people who reached out to touch my arm, to say, "Thank you, Professor," to share a memory of an old record. And I made my way not to the VIP section, not to Harrison Davenport's table, but to the back of the room, to the bar. He was standing there, my son, Marcus. He was not in his tuxedo, the armor of his old life. He was in a simple, dark shirt, his sleeves rolled up. He was not drinking. He was working. He was standing behind a small table with a simple, locked wooden box on it, the box I had built for him that afternoon in my workshop. And he was collecting donations for the new endowment. His head was bowed, his face a mask of quiet, focused, and deeply humble concentration, as he took a check from an older woman and handed her a receipt. He was not a lawyer. He was not a failed partner. He was a volunteer, a man doing the quiet, unglamorous, and deeply necessary work. I stood in the shadows just watching him. I watched him as he smiled at the woman, a real, genuine, and deeply tired smile. I watched as he carefully, meticulously placed her check into the slot in the box. He was using his hands, not to build like me, not to argue like he used to, but to serve, to help, to be a part of something larger than himself. He finally looked up, his work done for a moment, and his eyes met mine across the crowded, noisy room. He saw me standing there, my trumpet in my hand. He did not look away in shame. He did not look over with a practiced false bravado. He simply saw me, and he smiled. It was not the pained, apologetic smile of a son seeking forgiveness. It was a new smile. A quiet, steady, and deeply respectful smile. The smile of a colleague. The smile of a man who has finally found his own true and solid foundation. I nodded back at him. A single, slow, and profound acknowledgement. I did not need to speak. He did not need to apologize. The music had said it all. The work had said it all. Our relationship was not what it had been. The easy, thoughtless, and ultimately hollow bond of our past was gone forever, a casualty of a war we had both in our own ways survived. But what was being built in its place here in this noisy, smoky, and beautiful room was something new, something quieter, something stronger, something that was not built on the shifting sands of obligation or guilt or shared blood. It was being built on the solid, unshakable, and eternal bedrock of mutual respect. He was not ashamed of me, and I was finally, and for the first time in a very long time, beginning to feel a flicker of pride for him. The legacy of my wife, of my music of my life, was not just in the endowment or in the applause. It was here, in the quiet, respectful, and hard-won smile of my son. The work was not over, but the foundation I knew was finally truly set. My daughter-in-law saw me as an embarrassment, a relic of a past she wanted to erase. She handed me an apron to make me a servant, but she only revealed that she was a servant to her own ambition. She didn't realize that the man she was trying to impress had more respect for my old jazz records than for her new money. True respect isn't about the job you have. It's about the work you've mastered. She tried to make me small, but only proved that she and her entire world were the ones that were. What about you? Do you believe that true respect is earned through character, not connections? I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments below. If you want to hear more stories like this one, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for listening.